It's a natural instinct in many species to protect their young, and sometimes it's not just their own babies, but any young that look like them. Regardless of your personal feelings on humans' earliest stage, it is a scientific fact that human babies are designed to emphasize their own adorable helplessness to make sure that other older humans take care of them. A baby's cry is an inherently distressing sound, and when we hear it, some deep primal part of us feels the urge to comfort and care for the child until the sound stops. But of course, we're talking about the world of the SCP Foundation here, where there are bunnies that can eat anything, teddy bears that might steal your organs to make duplicates of themselves, and chocolate fountains filled with trillions of murderous insects. Nothing is what it seems here, and even the most innocent and cute creatures may be hiding a deadly secret. SCP-734 being no exception. Today we're talking about the baby. This anomaly proves that dangerous things can come in small packages, but where others only saw misery and death, the SCP Foundation saw a certain potential. Our story begins in the maternity ward of a hospital in the USA, where every medical professional's worst nightmare was unfolding. An unknown but incredibly fast-acting flesh-eating pathogen seemed to be running rampant across the hospital's population. It began when patients who weren't even admitted for dermatological issues started complaining of severe itches and extreme skin pain. Some nurses and doctors in the maternity ward began to experience similar symptoms, as well as one of the infants, leading to a massive quarantine effort. While the initial symptoms first appeared to be limited to severe pain and discomfort on isolated parts of the skin, the condition of the afflicted soon escalated. Their skin began to messily flake off as the cells comprising it lost physical cohesion and died. It was a kind of strange, anomalous rot that seemed to work inwards, first destroying the integrity of the outer layer of skin, and then cause further disintegration to deeper parts of the body. Once the skin had shut off, the pathogen would turn its attention to what was lying beneath. Against all odds, the disease affected organs, muscle tissue, the vascular system, and even bones. Nothing was spared. The victims' bodies would completely break down, and they would be dead within a few hours. By the time the pathogen had finished ravaging its victims, what was left didn't even look human anymore. Not only patients, but doctors and nurses that had been walking the wards mere hours before were now little more than piles of human tissue sitting in what had previously been their hospital beds. Whatever this was, it seemed like the fastest progressing infection in recorded history. Hospital staff and administrators were terrified. This appeared to be an entirely new disease, with a mysterious form of transmission and, worst of all, no cure. They were even more confused when several black vans pulled up outside the hospital, and mysterious men in hazmat suits spilled out and began setting up a quarantine zone around the entire building. Whoever these strange people were, they definitely weren't the CDC. Little did the hospital personnel know that this was the group you'd never want showing up and putting your location on lockdown. It was the SCP Foundation. The infected remains of the victims were taken away for research purposes, and the Foundation operatives immediately began conducting debriefing interviews with witnesses. They soon determined from a mix of eyewitness accounts and hospital surveillance footage that everyone infected with the mysterious pathogen had all been in a particular section of the maternity ward earlier in the day. And when the operatives investigated this area, they found another strange detail. An infant had no registered mother present in the hospital. The Foundation would later learn that this was likely because the baby's mother was the first victim of the deadly disease. After eliminating all other possible options, it seemed that the only anomalous element that could have caused all of this was the mysterious baby. Though just how the mother even survived carrying the baby to term was a mystery in and of itself. The baby was a Caucasian male human infant between 7 and 8 months of age. Nothing appeared outwardly anomalous about the child, but they could confirm that every single victim of the anomalous pathogen had come into physical contact with the child earlier that day. Everyone who had been at the hospital was given amnestic treatment, and the Foundation constructed plausible cover stories for the deaths that had occurred that day. Like so many others before it, the child was secured and spirited away to the nearest applicable Foundation containment site. There it was reclassified SCP-734, and finally the real testing into what precisely this infant was capable of could begin. Physiologically, SCP-734 appeared mostly non-anomalous. The infant had above-average intelligence and physical aptitude for a child his age, but otherwise showed no mutations or abnormalities that would suggest a divergence from typical human biology. Despite a vast array of tests performed by the Foundation into essentially every aspect of 734's biology, they couldn't find anything that hinted at the origin of the mysterious pathogen. But through some trial and extremely costly error, the Foundation was able to learn more about how exactly the pathogen worked. The only vector for transmission seemed to be direct contact with the baby itself, up to and including the fluids and residues it leaves behind. Those affected cannot transmit the anomalous flaking effect to others, meaning the risk of an epidemic is relievingly minimal. But of course, accidents still happen, as was discovered when one agent misplaced her sympathy for the baby and decided to remove her mask while interacting with him. Her logic was that her masked face might have caused the baby some kind of distress, and as long as she was only coming into contact with him via her own gloved hands, everything would be fine. But some dust particles were floating in the air at the time, and SCP-734 sneezed in her face. The agent began screaming in pain and recoiling from the baby, but it was already too late. Her fate was sealed. She was taken to the infirmary and given sedatives so that she could hopefully die in as little pain as possible. In roughly 72% of cases, amputation of the affected areas has prevented the entire body from succumbing to the anomalous effects of SCP-734. But this isn't exactly feasible, where the point of contact is the victim's head. Within hours, the agent's flesh had flaked off her face, leaving her looking like a red, bloody skull. A few hours after that, she didn't have a head at all. Throughout the disintegration process of this unfortunate agent, the Foundation took grisly photographs. These photographs are shown to anyone preparing to work on the SCP-734 research project, to teach them a hard lesson on the importance of adhering to proper safety protocols. And these protocols about how to deal with the baby are incredibly tight, given that even incidental contact is often a death sentence. Anyone entering the baby's containment chamber needs to wear contained atmosphere hazmat suits. Anyone who makes physical contact with the baby, even when suited up, is immediately removed from the area and subject to several hours of quarantine and observation. Even inanimate objects that have been inside the containment chamber need to be thoroughly sterilized before being removed. Given that even anomalous children like SCP-734 have very delicate needs, a handler is always standing by in full hazmat gear to take care of the baby. These handlers are rotated every hour to maintain alertness and safety. These handlers feed and change SCP-734 regularly, and sometimes even provide toys that have been approved by the O5 Council. The Foundation has gone to great lengths to keep SCP-734 alive and comfortable, because they believe that SCP-734 could be an important asset for them in the future. Or more specifically, they see great strategic value in SCP-734's blood. As mentioned earlier, contact with any matter from SCP-734 triggers its deadly anomalous effects, including bodily fluids like blood. But unlike many toxic pathogens, in this case, there is no risk of the infection getting out of control, since the infected do not become vectors for transmission. Because of this, the blood of SCP-734 can act as a powerful weapon for both terminating anomalies deemed unviable by the O5 Council and assassinating dangerous people who belong to rival groups. Contact with the blood would completely destroy the target's body, with no other anomalous effects and no evidence of who exactly conducted the hit. SCP-734 has been fitted with an arterial catheter so that the Foundation can collect large quantities of blood from the anomalous infant every single week for storage and research. But it isn't just the blood that the Foundation sees potential in. SCP-734 himself has scored incredibly well on the Esslinger Loyalty Index, the test the Foundation uses to judge the loyalty of potential applicants to the Foundation cause. As SCP-734 matures, if these scores remain consistent, he will likely be trained to become a Foundation field agent in the future. An agent capable of killing someone with a touch would, needless to say, be an asset to certain covert missions that the Foundation would probably prefer to keep off the books. Of course, the SCP Foundation recruiting certain compliant anomalies to perform missions for them is far from unprecedented. The most infamous of these is SCP-076, also known as Abel, a supernatural, eternally resurrecting swordsman, and perhaps one of the finest warriors who ever lived. The Foundation took note of this and channeled his eternal thirst for battle into working with his very own mobile task force. He could assist in missions by taking out his bloodlust on enemy groups of interest and dangerous anomalies. However, this ended up working a little too well and led to disaster. Abel was so good at his job that he burned through all of his allotted missions at astonishing speed. Left with nothing more to do, Abel got antsy, which led him to turning his murderous desires on his fellow team members, and then the Foundation as a whole. It was an all-out massacre before his colleagues were finally able to kill him and return him to containment. The failure of this initiative gave the very idea of letting anomalies work for the Foundation in the field a bad name. But since then, things have changed, especially with the establishment of MTF Alpha 9, aka Last Hope, a new mobile task force formed entirely of anomalous individuals and their handlers. These consist of somewhat more stable anomalies, such as Abel's counterpart SCP-073, also known as Cain. Cain cannot be harmed, with any harm befalling him simply being mirrored back on his attacker, and his vast array of knowledge makes him an incredibly useful, intelligent asset. Another of the several members of Last Hope is Iris, also known as SCP-105. Much like Cain, Iris not only has anomalous powers that make her immensely valuable for missions in the field, she's also compliant and capable of listening to reason, unlike Cain. Her abilities include being able to actively surveil and even interact with photos of any location, especially when taken with her anomalous camera. Someday, SCP-734 could count himself among other anomalous Foundation agents like these, providing he continues to show promise and doesn't develop a dislike of the Foundation as he ages, since after all, he won't be a baby forever. So if you ever find yourself on the Foundation's bad side, you have a good reason to be paranoid. You'll have no idea that one day, the man who's going to kill you will approach and shake your hand with a smile. It won't be until later, when you feel that strange tingle on your palm and feel the skin starting to flake away, that you'll realize you've been a dead man walking for hours.
The young girl stood silently in a room full of corpses, staring off into the distance. She was in a trance, seemingly unaware of the carnage that had just unfolded around her. Some of the men were shot or stabbed or beaten. Others had no apparent cause of death whatsoever, but the young girl was unscathed. She was wearing a yellow summer dress and looked like she couldn't have been more than 3 years old. She awoke from her trance, still paying no heed to the violence in the room, and left. This is the story of SCP-053. The young girl. Her strange and terrifying life before containment, her thrilling capture, and the part she played in one of the most dangerous SCP Foundation cross-tests of all time. She had no name. The young girl could never spend enough time around someone to be given one. It was her terrible curse that she could never stay in one place for too long, or something truly awful would happen to everyone around her. She'd been drifting for years, but never grew to look older than a child. Her memories were long but formless, divided mostly into 10-minute increments. The young girl kept on moving. It was all she could do. In 1993, when the young girl had already been alive for a very long time, she found herself in Illinois after days of trekking on the roadside. She would scavenge what little food she needed from the trash and drink from lakes, rivers, or even puddles when she needed to. Deep down, the young girl knew that if she ever grew hungry or thirsty, she would not die. In her travels, the young girl had managed to scrounge together a few dollars, and though she knew her contact with people had to be limited, there was one thing she wanted that felt worth the risk: a candy bar. It'd been a long time since she tasted chocolate, and she found the idea of tasting it again too enticing to resist. When she reached Chicago, she entered a small corner store with her handful of dollars, selected a candy bar from the rack, and approached the counter. For reasons even she didn't fully understand, she kept her eyes down as she placed the money on the counter. You see, SCP-053 was always a special child. As we briefly mentioned earlier, you might even say she was cursed. Whenever she was around other people for too long, terrible things tended to happen. Unspeakable things. And as a component of this strange, unexplainable curse, or perhaps as a means of keeping her safe from it, the young girl was doomed to never understand the nature of her predicament. It was like there was a mental wall between her and the horrors her presence could cause. All she knew was that it was best to avoid eye contact, stay away from large groups of people at all costs, and never spend any longer than 10 minutes around anyone, ever. That's why, as she waited for her chocolate bar at the cash register, she kept her head down and waited to go. The cashier looked upon this strange girl with apparent concern. It had been a slow day, all in all. A few listless patrons milled around the store, window shopping. His brain was practically on autopilot until he saw this child. She looked filthy, in a disheveled dress, and was totally alone. What on earth had happened to this child? The more he looked at her, the more he sensed a creepy vibe exuding from her. Something about this girl was wrong. He spoke softly to her, introducing himself as Miles, and asking her where her mommy and daddy were. The young girl hesitated for just a few seconds too long for his liking, before simply saying that they were at home. Any parent who'd let their 3-year-old kid just wander around the south side of Chicago alone was either crazy, neglectful, or both. He asked her politely to remain in the store while he gave the police a quick call. He'd even let her have the candy bar for free while she waited. Immediately, the little girl became uncomfortable. She had already been in here for a few minutes now, and while Miles called the police, he expected her to wait around even longer. Again, she couldn't even tell you why she knew waiting around like this would be so dangerous, but she had a nagging, instinctual awareness that she needed to get out. Around the store, the few patrons still inside started to get a strange feeling, like someone was watching them. Soon, what seemed like mild paranoia was quickly becoming white-hot anger. Pure rage. They felt almost like they had to kill someone, but not just anyone. Someone particular. They had to kill the little girl. It wasn't long until the police arrived. 2 officers, Holiday and DeWitt, entered to collect the apparently neglected little girl. It was a story they'd sadly heard all too often, a tragically common occurrence in the big city. When the 2 of them approached the young girl, she was looking down at the ground. They tried to speak to her, but she was unresponsive. Miles looked on, concerned, but deep down, he felt the same bizarre progression all the other storegoers were feeling. Confusion, irritability, and finally, violent rage. The corner store was a powder keg. All it needed now was a spark. And that spark came when Officer Holiday reached down and took the young girl by the arm. His bare skin touched hers, and it was all over. The cop twitched. His mind washed out in murderous insanity as he reached for his sidearm. Officer DeWitt opened his mouth to protest, but he didn't manage to get a syllable out before Holiday turned and shot him. In a fraction of a second, the quiet corner store exploded into a violent bloodbath as the patrons and cops slaughtered each other. All the while, the young girl just stood there in a trance. Everyone was dead within minutes, except Miles and the young girl. He shakily rose to his feet, his mind carved out by madness, and reached for Officer Holiday's discarded pistol. Outside of the store, the young girl appeared, walking out as if nothing had happened. Inside, Miles's body was sprawled over the counter, clutching his chest as if his heart had just exploded. This was the true nature of the young girl's curse. Anyone who meets her eye, touches her skin, or spends over 10 minutes around her is destined to slip into a state of murderous insanity. They'll go into a kill-crazy frenzy and attack anyone around them until all that is left is them and the young girl. At which point they'll try to kill her too, but the mere act of attempting to kill her is also fatal, killing its victims with a massive heart attack or a seizure. The second part of the girl's curse is that she herself can never die. she keeps coming back, unknowingly causing more misery and death along the way. Until, of course, a certain secret organization took notice. That night, the young girl sat in the cavernous interior of a local abandoned warehouse, quietly eating her hard-earned candy bar. Suddenly, she heard a quiet crack in the distance. She tried to move her left arm, but found it was numb. She could barely move it. The girl turned her head and saw a tranquilizer dart sticking out of her skin. Instinctively, she got up and began to run, limping as her left leg started to lose all feeling too. Suddenly, she was surrounded by footsteps as masked men in SWAT uniforms emerged out of the darkness on all sides. The last thing she remembered before slipping out of consciousness was a blindfold being pulled over her eyes and tiny metal handcuffs clasping over her wrists. When she woke up, she was in the nicest room she had slept in years. It was 16 feet by 16 feet, with toys, books, and games. Standing across the room from her was a stranger in a full hazmat suit, connected to a long steel cable leading out of the room. He spoke calmly and politely. A timer on his wrist counted down from 10 minutes. The stranger explained to the young girl that they would be taking care of her now, and would provide her with all the toys and games and treats she wanted, provided she cooperated and submitted willingly to some tests. Compared to living out on the streets with no food or comfort, this seemed like an excellent compromise. She would live in what seemed like luxury, and every so often, she'd be taken to a testing room with a stranger in an orange jumpsuit. After a few minutes of waiting, the stranger would inevitably go feral and attempt to kill her, and then always die in the process. The strangers in the hazmat suits told her that all of these tests were helping them learn extremely valuable things about her, and that soon they'd have a very special job for her. It would be a wonderful surprise. It was the spring of 1994 that the young girl, now officially designated SCP-053, finally received her special mission. Several strangers in full hazmat suits wielding rifles escorted her out of her usual bedroom. She asked where she was being taken and was told she was going to meet a new friend. She was taken to one of the recreational testing rooms and pushed inside. Out in front of her, she saw something terrifying. A giant reptilian creature. She retreated from it instinctually, hiding behind a chair in the containment area. The giant reptile didn't move. It just sat there. Eventually, she plucked up the courage to go and touch the creature before retreating again. No reaction. Little by little, the young girl gained confidence and continued to approach and pat the creature. It exhaled through its huge nostrils, and the young girl literally jumped for joy in her amusement. She began to play with the docile monster, hugging it, even drawing on it with a crayon. The observers were truly baffled. What the young girl didn't know was that she was playing with SCP-682, one of the most hateful and aggressive anomalies under the Foundation's watchful eye. And yet, in her presence, the creature was like an overgrown puppy dog. After the test phase, the young girl was removed from the hard-to-kill reptile's presence, immediately causing the creature to become violent and murderous once again. After being separated from her strange new friend, the young girl was seen crying for several minutes. According to all accounts, the young girl is eager to see her friend again someday, though considering the reptile killed several guards after their separation, the Foundation isn't eager to grant her that wish. SCP-053 was classified as Euclid and continues to be held in containment, with her toys, books, and games rotated out on a regular basis. Seeing as she shows no sign of aging, this ongoing containment is likely to be the sad, strange fate of the young girl, an anomaly that never wanted to hurt anyone, but an important and cruel reminder that what we want doesn't always influence the world in the way we want.
SCP-682 must be destroyed as soon as possible. So begins the SCP Foundation file on the dreaded SCP-682, a highly intelligent reptilian monster that has, despite the Foundation's best efforts, proved impossible to kill. It may not be the most dangerous SCP out there, considering that some are capable of eliminating entire realities, but it's one of the most iconic. And you've probably heard tales of the monster that death forgot, and you know exactly why everyone is so afraid of the so-called hard-to-kill reptile. It's been subjected to some of the most deadly weapons and traps the Foundation could devise, and survived attacks from some of its deadliest fellow SCPs. But before we tell you about the Foundation's many failed assassination attempts against the so-called hard-to-kill Reptile, we need a little more groundwork on what this creature even is. The first thing to know about SCP-682 is that this thing wants you and everything you know dead. Unlike some other creatures like SCP-096 and SCP-173, which are murderous but exhibit no real higher processing skills, SCP-682 possesses cunning, advanced reasoning, and even human-level logical intelligence. SCP-682 can engage you in conversation, but just talking to the creature calmly and cordially will sometimes cause it to enter its rage state, where it becomes even more dangerous and volatile. The beast is perpetually kept in a tank of powerful hydrochloric acid, melting its tissue to prevent it from reaching its full potential and going on a rampage. The creature's most terrifying asset, and the reason it's proven impossible to terminate thus far, is its incredible adaptability to any and all external stimuli. 682 is a reactive being, capable of not only surviving and regenerating from all attacks, but often incorporating those attacks into its own wide arsenal. In other words, if you're hoping to kill this thing, you better kill it on the first hit. Because if you don't, you better believe it's gonna hit you back 100 times harder. This brings us to the main event. Some of the SCP Foundation's most ambitious and frightening attempts to terminate SCP-682, or even understand how it could theoretically be terminated. There are quite literally too many unsuccessful attempts for us to list them all here, so think of this as a highlight reel of the Foundation's most prominent failures. 682 was first cross-tested with SCP-017, a humanoid shadow entity shown to be able to consume matter with its shadows and leave no traces behind. Tests on tissue samples from 682 showed that SCP-017 was able to consume said tissues with no adverse effects. However, when SCP-017 was placed into the containment chamber with the actual creature, 682 let out a horrific roar that was so loud it damaged nearby audio equipment. SCP-017 fled to the corner of the room, and 682, in its rage state, attempted to breach containment. Agents managed to suppress and remove the creature, but no meaningful damage was logged. Attempt failed. SCP-173, the killer statue, was later brought in, hoping that its thus far impeccable track record for killing would hold strong. The second that 173 was introduced into the testing area, 682 retreated to the far wall and began screeching intensely. It was intelligent enough to know what it was dealing with here. While the researchers and guards expected an instantaneous reaction, there was actually a stalemate for over 6 hours, as 682 stared at 173 continuously. Eventually, the tie was broken when agents shot out 682's eyes with high-caliber sniper rifles, breaking the line of sight and causing 173 to attack. Though 682 sustained damage to several parts of its body, while its eyes regenerated, the creature was not killed. It then regenerated a number of eyes all over its body, covered in a clear armored carapace that made them resistant to bullets. The stalemate continued for an additional 12 hours as 682 maintained perpetual eye contact. 173 was eventually removed from the containment unit, and the mission was aborted. Attempt failed. In their desperation, the SCP Foundation restored to bringing in another dangerous and seemingly unkillable monster to take on 682. SCP-096, also known as the Shy Guy. As astute SCP fans will already know, this being kills anything that sees its face, with no known exceptions, and when it enters its attack mode, it's thought to be quite literally unstoppable. Or at least, it was. While SCP-096 was able to destroy 85% of 682's original body mass during their 27-hour battle, it was left mentally broken, wounded, and huddled in the corner. To this day, if ever confronted with SCP-682, the Shy Guy reacts in pure terror, turning away and clawing at its own face. Attempt failed. During a deadly containment breach, SCP-682 also went head-to-head organically with another iconic SCP Hall of Famer, SCP-106, also known as the Old Man. The Old Man and a shape-shifting psionic anomaly known as SCP-953 broke into 682's containment cell. The Old Man pulled both of his fellow anomalous combatants into his pocket dimension to continue the battle on his terms. However, despite losing 67% of his body mass during the ensuing pocket dimension showdown, 682 still prevailed, with the old man eventually fleeing back to his cell and 953 being collected and taken away by agents. Once again, SCP-682 continued to hold the title. But it wasn't just cross-testing experiments, intentional or otherwise. The SCP Foundation's quest to kill 682 led them to a number of more conventional murder methods, all with varying degrees of success. Due to SCP-682's highly adaptive abilities, some methods were discounted from the outset. For example, launching a powerful thermonuclear missile at the creature was soundly rejected by O5 Command, on the premise that if the creature wasn't destroyed and evolved to the point where it could shrug off nukes, humanity would be pretty much done for. Other ideas were abandoned just for being too ridiculous, such as one researcher's suggestion to fly the creature through the air and drop it from a considerable height, hoping to kill it with a high-altitude impact. I'm not sure we even need to tell you why that's a terrible idea, but during the experiments on SCP-682, the studies range from honest to incompetent to straight-up evil. One guest researcher fed 2 small innocent children to the creature just to see what would happen. He was then himself fed to the creature for his sadistic behavior, which was viewed as getting in the way of his professional conduct. After all, the Foundation is meant to be cold, not cruel. It was SCP-682 that had the monopoly on cruelty. Memetic kill agents were a resounding failure. They attempted to dismember 682 with a powerful laser, only to have the creature develop reflective surfaces that displaced the beam and caused catastrophic damage to the area around it. They attempted to kill the creature by sucking all the air out of its containment facility and create a vacuum, but it expelled a dangerous gaseous compound that reacted violently and exploded when air was once again introduced into the room. The Foundation used high-precision blades to slice SCP-682 into approximately 12,000 pieces, then separated these pieces. Unsurprisingly, by this point, this attempt also failed. The 12,000 pieces reformed a short while later into the fully operational killing machine we all know and fear. In one particularly frightening display of intelligence and adaptability, the Foundation attempted to kill 682 with extreme heat, but it shielded itself by developing a second carapace composed of solid helium. When personnel entered the room following the failed attempt on the creature's life, it shattered its helium carapace into deadly shards that fired around the room and shredded all Foundation personnel in attendance. It had set a trap, and that trap had been wildly successful. The creature's ability to adapt to seemingly any offense is unparalleled, to the point where Foundation staff have no idea how to classify this creature, whether it's organic, inorganic, or even alive at all based on any definitions we could understand. At every turn, the creature just raised more questions. What is it? Is it possible to destroy it at all by any means? Who was even trying to kill who here? Because it certainly seemed like SCP-682 had a masterful KD ratio by now. More extreme feats of cross-testing continued in the Foundation's growing desperation to eliminate this monster. SCP-162, which is a hypnotic ball of sharp objects, hooks, and high-tension fishing line, was introduced to 682's containment cell. The hooks latched onto the creature and tore huge portions off, including its entire lower jaw and one of its limbs. However, 682 was still able to breach containment, kill 11 people, and badly wound 86 others. It regenerated its severe injuries in no time. The beast was even taken to the domain of the Gate Guardian, one of the proposals for SCP-001. The Guardian had a flaming sword hotter than the sun, capable of destroying its targets on an atomic level. Naturally, SCP-682 survived and regenerated. Perhaps the most fascinating cross-test of all was between 682 and SCP-053, who manifests as a kind, innocent little girl with the unfortunate condition of causing homicidal tendencies in all who come into contact with her for more than 10 minutes. The people with these tendencies would then attempt to harm the girl, but would immediately drop dead shortly after, leaving the girl intact. The researchers present anticipated 2 possible outcomes here. The optimistic outcome, in which 682 enters a rage state, attacks 053, and died for good, and the realistic outcome, in which 682 attacks 053, possibly experiencing some minor injury or nothing at all, and 053 had to be removed from the containment cell. But that didn't happen. What did occur was considerably more shocking than any kind of violence. When 053 entered 682's containment chamber, the monster became uncharacteristically docile. Researchers and staff were baffled and watched with amazement as 053 approached the terrifying, immortal, mass-murdering monster and began to play with it. 682 even allowed 053 to draw on its face with crayons. Researchers thought they must have been dreaming, seeing this surreal display play out. 053 even appeared to have affection for this unkillable misanthrope. It was a single act in defiance of everything they thought they knew. When Foundation personnel entered the containment cell to separate the two, 682 went ballistic and killed multiple guards. 053 also wept, sad at being separated from her new friend. To this day, despite further testing, the Foundation has no idea how or why this happened. Like many details surrounding SCP-682, it's shrouded in deeply frustrating mystery. And so the tale of SCP-682 continues, in spite of the Foundation's best efforts. The monster continues to breach containment and slaughter with some regularity, taking out its seemingly limitless hatred for not only human beings, but anything that dares draw breath. Nobody knows where exactly the creature is from, what its true nature is, or why its ability to adapt and regenerate far exceeds any known organism on this planet. Perhaps one day, through enough research and cross-testing, we can someday answer these questions with scientific precision, but until then, we only have one answer. Hatred never dies.
It's the late 90s, and an Air Canada flight experiences severe malfunctions while traveling from London to Vancouver. The pilots are unable to do anything and the plane crashes into the woods of northern Alberta. The crash was devastating. Only 10 of the nearly 300 people on board are alive. And even though they survived the initial disaster, their battle for life has only just begun. It's late autumn in northern Canada, and there's no telling when help will arrive, if at all. If the survivors want to make it through the night, they need to find shelter, and fast. As they trudge through the freezing woods, the group finds a path that looks like it might lead them to civilization. After all, if there was a path in the woods, that meant they were probably in a national park. And if they were in a national park, there had to be a ranger station around somewhere where they could warm up and call for help. They didn't have many other options, so they followed the path which opened up to a clearing. But instead of finding a ranger station or campground, they found something none of them could have expected. It was a pond, but there was something off about it. As they got closer, they saw that this strange pond wasn't filled with water, but blood. The survivors were horrified. That couldn't really be blood, could it? It must have been a weird algae or chemical reaction. But one member of the group, a man named Thomas Dean, who had been on his way back to his hometown of Prince George, British Columbia, thought there was something strangely familiar about this. He remembered being a boy and going to visit family in Alberta, and hearing an urban legend from the older local kids. According to the stories, somewhere out in the wilderness, in the northern part of the province, there was a pond full of human blood. And what made it even worse was that some said the pond was a gateway to hell. The SCP Foundation was also aware of this legend and had been trying to pinpoint the exact source of it for decades prior to the Air Canada crash. They would finally receive definite confirmation of the blood pond when Foundation personnel intercepted a radio transmission from a ranger station located within the Wood Buffalo National Park. It was the survivors of the crash who had managed to make it through the night, and they were about to be escorted out of the park by rangers. The Foundation mobilized quickly to cordon off the pond, as at the time they were unsure of what potentially harmful properties the pond might have had. They set up Watch Station Epsilon 38 and put staff on guard to deter travelers from the area. The pond was given the designation of SCP-354 and classed as Euclid. Foundation scientists made a number of interesting discoveries about SCP-354 when they collected samples for testing. First, the pond was not in fact full of blood, merely an inorganic liquid that closely resembles blood in color and consistency. Second, and even stranger than the red liquid, is that the pond doesn't seem to have any definite banks or a bottom. Instead, the liquid in the pond increases in density as the radius away from the center increases. The liquid congeals at the edges, becoming more solid and blending into the surrounding soil. It also becomes thicker as one descends deeper into the pool, and the bottom of the pond has not yet been reached, if it even exists. Initially, the Foundation found no signs of life within the blood pond, but that would all change at 2:03 p.m. on the day following the opening of Watch Station Epsilon 38. When the science team noticed an unusual level of activity on the pond's surface, security footage feeds showed a shape rising out of the pond, followed by a deafening shriek. After that, the feed was cut and Foundation lost all communication with Watch Station Epsilon 38. Fearing the worst, a mobile task force was dispatched to the location. When they got there, all personnel at the watch station had been killed by what could only be described as a gigantic bat. The task force was able to neutralize the entity, and as soon as they could, the Foundation moved in to increase security around the SCP, creating Area 354 and installing a permanent security detail. After this point, the pond started to regularly spit out a variety of monstrous entities, almost as if it was reacting to the SCP Foundation's increased security measures. After SCP-354-1, the giant bat, came SCP-354-2. 354-2 was an echidna-like monster the size of a bear that was virtually bulletproof but unable to escape Area 354. The Foundation neutralized this anomaly with napalm. SCP-354-3 was a floating black sphere capable of firing deadly beams of concentrated energy. The area's head scientist was able to hit it with a sledgehammer, causing the sphere to malfunction and self-destruct before it was able to escape the area. The Foundation wasn't as lucky with SCP-354-4. This creature was a reptilian humanoid that stood roughly 15 feet tall and was unable to be put down with gunfire. This was the first creature from the pond to successfully escape containment and was only able to be neutralized when the Foundation sent in Mobile Task Force Omega-7, also known as Pandora's Box. The data on pond incursions is partially corrupted, so a complete list of creatures is not available, but some of the other monsters that came out of the blood pond include a killer robot, a set of gigantic tentacles that drag several D-class personnel into the pond, a pair of panther-like creatures, one made of ice and the other of magma, that ignored Foundation staff and instead fought each other, and one seemingly normal human man who was executed as soon as he emerged from the pond. Tests on his body revealed that he was, in fact, totally normal and would have posed no threat. These anomalies came out of the pond at fairly regular intervals for several months, before the pond went silent for an unprecedented 22 months. The head scientist at the time noted, "I suspect this means one of two things. Either the red pool has died or powered down, or whatever the correct term for it is, or is charging up for something big to come through. O5 believes the former is the most likely explanation, and has recalled 30% of our total personnel and cut 25% of our funding. While I can only hope that they are correct, if the latter situation is true, we're soon to face some terrible monstrosity and we won't have anywhere near the force necessary to deal with it. I worry for all of our safety." His words would prove eerily prophetic following the events of Exploratory Mission 354 Alpha. The Foundation's research and development team built a specialized craft to explore the pond. Because of the strange properties of the pond's density, the craft was essentially made to be both a submarine for parts of the pond where the contents were liquid, and a drill for when the liquid congealed into a semi-solid towards the bottom. The exploration team consisted of Agent Swanson, Agent Turquoise, Agent 86, Dr. J. MacArthur, Chris Simmons, Leroy Tucker, and a pilot named Martin. With the team assembled, the ship was sent down into the pond. Nothing eventful happened for the first 2 days of the mission, but at 4:30 a.m. on the third day, gravity suddenly reversed for the crew of the ship. This seemed to indicate that they were approaching the halfway point, though what would be on the other side, nobody could say. On the fourth day, the ship surfaced, proving definitely that the pond was in fact some sort of portal. The crew looked out of the portholes to see the darkness of night above them. While sensors outside the ship detected nothing harmful in the atmosphere around them, the crew were wary of exiting the craft. The other side of the pond was nothing like the world the crew knew. For one thing, the night lasted for 28 hours before dawn came, and when the sun finally rose, it was much larger and redder than the Earth's sun. Under the light of the strange red star, the crew could see that the pond on this side was massive compared to what they've come into, more like a large lake. Surrounding the lake was sand and rocks that were covered in a kind of moss that disappeared under sunlight and regrew during the night. The team left the ship and started to explore. During their time in this strange world, they found that the day lasted just a few hours shorter than the night, meaning that whatever planet they were on had a roughly 43-hour-long rotation as opposed to our own planet's 24. The team found a number of anomalous elements on their expedition, including razor-sharp grass that can puncture skin and streams of liquid carbon dioxide. They heard some loud roars in the distance once or twice, but other than that, the planet was eerily silent, with seemingly no animal life and not even wind. When it rained, the soil remained dry, and based on that, the scientists theorized the plants in this world were more efficient at absorbing moisture. On the 25th day, the team ran into a huge metal wall that appeared to be artificially constructed. Luckily, Leroy Tucker, a quick-thinking researcher, was able to rig a blowtorch from camping supplies and melt a hole through the metal. On the other side, there was finally wind and odd black grass. That's the extent of what is known about the other side of the wall, because the expedition logs are heavily corrupted after that point. But we know that whatever was in there wasn't good, because the team never returned. Strangely, there's no record of any names mentioned in the ship's log, almost as if being killed on the other side completely erased them from history. No other expeditions into the pond were launched after that. On an undisclosed date, a year following the discovery of the Blood Pond and construction of Area 354, the site was completely evacuated, and power was cut to the area. Mobile Task Force Data 12 was dispatched to investigate the cause of the evacuation, but before contact could be established, the area's on-site nuclear warhead was detonated, completely destroying the site. MTF Data 12 was then attacked by a convoy made up of D-Class and other low-ranking staff who had evacuated Area 354. It was apparent that there had been some kind of mutiny within the site, and that a dissolution of the chain of command had led to its evacuation and destruction. The convoy totally annihilated MTF Theta 12, and no further contact with the former personnel of Area 354 has been made since. Following the site's detonation, a new site was constructed called simply the Red Pool Containment Site. Unlike the previous facility, which focused on research and neutralization, the new site is entirely concerned with containment. The shift in directive came as a response to the pond's apparent reactive nature. Each creature that emerged from the pond seemed to be in retaliation to the Foundation's actions, and it was theorized by some that the mutiny at Area 354 was triggered by some kind of psychic attack from the pond itself. An interview in the SCP file on 354 reveals that there was one more disastrous attempt to control and understand the Blood Pond. According to an interview with a Foundation agent, the head doctor proposed a scheme to drain the Blood Pond using a system of pumps and hoses. All non-essential personnel were evacuated in case of emergency, leaving only the pump technicians, D-Class personnel, and a few agents for security. However, as soon as the pump was scheduled to be turned on, everyone at the site experienced a mass dissociative episode. The agent described the feeling they all experienced as like being in a dream and suddenly realizing that you're asleep. He said, "Everything stopped being real. It was like we had to escape right now." When asked what happened when the pump was turned on, he simply explained that it wouldn't let them. This interview confirmed the theory that the pond is not only capable of releasing monsters out into our world, but also that it's capable of powerful but much more subtle psychological attacks. This suggests a chilling possibility, that the pond isn't just blindly reacting to being attacked, but it's fully sentient, and the actions of the SCP Foundation have only served to annoy it. And worst, studies of the pond's banks have proved evidence that the area of congealed liquid around the perimeter of the pond has been steadily expanding. That's right, the pond is getting bigger. The last thing the Foundation agent stationed at the site said before being dragged out of the interview and sedated was, "It gets bigger and stronger every day, and now we've made it angry."
On March 15, 2011, Martin Sims was wandering down the streets of Carson, California. His clothes were ragged, he was filthy, and gibbering like a madman with a full beard and long, unkempt hair. His body was covered in scars, but he showed no signs of malnutrition. What made Martin's sudden appearance so remarkable? He'd been missing for 3 years. When he was interviewed by police, they asked him where he'd been all this time. They couldn't believe his answer. He'd been trapped in an IKEA since 2008, but this was no ordinary IKEA. This was a dangerous anomaly that would come to be known as SCP-3008. Martin's strange answers in his interview were laughed off by his interviewing officers, who assumed he was either crazy or under the influence of something, but they caught the attention of an SCP Foundation field agent embedded in the precinct. The report was passed up the chain to a local site director who approved a detachment of Foundation field operatives to look into Martin's case. While he was reluctant to lead the Foundation agents back to the offending IKEA, the Foundation can be extremely persuasive. His screams of, "Please, I'm begging you, don't take me back, don't make me go back," were noted but ultimately disregarded. When the SCP Foundation had triangulated the position of SCP-3008, which was indeed an active IKEA, the entire retail zone was closed and barricaded under the pretense of a severe black mold infestation. Armed Foundation personnel also arrived on the site shortly after, based on Martin's vague statements that there were creatures of some kind inside. Due to his deteriorating mental health, Martin was unable to provide a great deal of lucid information on the specific traits of SCP-3008. But one phrase he kept repeating was "bigger on the inside." Once researchers were satisfied that Martin had delivered all the pertinent information he was able to, he was administered Foundation amnestics to erase his memory of the last 3 years and return to his family. A cover story was formulated. Martin had been kidnapped and abused for 3 years by a mentally unbalanced stalker in downtown Carson. He'd been able to escape as said stalker took his own life out of guilt, a suicide that the Foundation expertly fabricated to make their cover story airtight. With the loose end of Martin Sims taken care of, the true observation of SCP-3008 could begin. A base set around the perimeter of the mysterious IKEA kept a 24-hour watch on the building, covering all potential entrances and exits. No exploratory missions had yet been approved by the Foundation Ethics Committee, so they first wanted to perform a week of external observation to see if any of the store's anomalous properties extended beyond the confines of the building. After a week of nothing, it appeared they did not. A local site director approved of the use of 20 disposable Class D personnel to explore the interior of SCP-3008. The D-Class operatives would be split into 4 squads of 5 men, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta Squad. Each would be assigned a different quadrant of the store and would deliver information back to the control team on site via a live audio and video link. 3 of the 4 teams upon entering the store reported nothing out of the ordinary. Neither the audio or video they were sending back indicated anything different from a standard IKEA store, from the flat-pack wardrobes to the Swedish meatballs. Team Delta, however, suddenly began experiencing a scrambled audio and video connection. Shortly after, communication with Team Delta dropped off entirely. They disappeared somewhere inside the store and haven't been seen since, with one notable exception. After the disappearance and the extraction of teams, Foundation researchers classified SCP-3008 as Euclid because its anomalous properties were at least confined to the interior of the store, and even then seemingly not the entire interior. The anomalous area within SCP-3008 became known as SCP-3008-1, and containment appeared to be 100% secure. There was no telling how many people had already gone missing in the store over the years, but the disappearances must be stopped. The Foundation maintained constant surveillance around the perimeter of SCP-3008, but it appeared they could prevent any further incidents by simply preventing other civilians from accessing the IKEA store. Martin's ravings about monsters were assumed to just be the product of delirium, until a surviving member of Delta Team suddenly reappeared. The date was November 3, 2011. It was a cold night, a few hours after what would have been closing time if the store were still active, and 7 months after the extraction teams had disappeared somewhere in the confines of SCP-3008. There had been no anomalous activity outside the store since the perimeter was first secured, and the Foundation researchers hadn't expected that to change until the last surviving member of Delta Team came barging out of the store's entrance. Startled field operatives were amazed to see him again, but they were even more amazed to see what was following him out of the store, repeating the same phrase: "The store is now closed, please exit the building." Despite the fact that the entity chasing the Delta Team survivor was wearing the yellow shirt and blue pants of an IKEA store employee, the being definitely was not human. It was around 7 feet tall with no visible face. The entity had grossly extended limbs, with each arm being around 5 or 6 feet long and ending in a huge oversized hand. The whole process was so sudden that the field agents present at the perimeter weren't able to save the Delta Team survivor, as the entity reached forward with his freakishly long arms, grabbed him and twisted his head off like a child with a doll. The field operatives present drew their weapons and peppered the entity with bullets. It would later be classified as SCP-3008-2. The being appeared to collapse and die from the physical trauma, at which point it and the body of the former Delta Team survivor were taken for an autopsy by Foundation researchers. There were no biological abnormalities of the body of the Delta Team survivor, so it did not appear that the anomalous properties of SCP-3008-1 had any effect on the physiology of its occupants. He was not malnourished despite being missing for months, and the contents of his stomach looked to be half-digested food consistent with the menu of a typical IKEA store restaurant. SCP-3008-2, on the other hand, raised a number of perplexing biological questions. The autopsy revealed that the creature's clothes were actually part of its body, like an additional layer of skin. The creature lacked blood or any kind of vascular system. Even stranger, the entity didn't appear to have bones or internal organs, not even a brain or nervous system. It was a being made entirely of skin all the way to its core. How it was able to move, or even live for that matter, remains a mystery. Though when you work for the SCP Foundation, you learn to accept that some things will always remain unexplained. One thing was certain though, Martin Sims was right about his monsters. After the incident with Delta Team, the Foundation deemed that sending manned explorations into the heart of SCP-3008 was too much of a liability and planned a series of drone-based reconnaissance missions into the anomaly. The first of these drones experienced connection issues and failed when attempting to venture into the IKEA's anomalous zone. However, after a lengthy period of trial and error, the Foundation was able to establish a more secure connection with its drones, even when deep into the SCP-3008-1 anomalous zone. It was only then that some of the most extraordinary discoveries were made. SCP-3008-1 seemed to break the laws of spatial reality, as the area of the IKEA's interior was at least an order of magnitude larger than its exterior. Just as Martin Sims had said, it was bigger on the inside, but just how much bigger? The Foundation has yet to find evidence of any physical terminators within the store that might indicate SCP-3008-1 has an endpoint, while an area of at least 10 kilometers squared has been uncovered in SCP-3008-1. It could, in theory, be infinite. Laser rangefinder tests, which are normally very reliable, have only given inconclusive results. Interestingly, the anomalous area doesn't have any clear visual differences from the rest of the IKEA store, except that it extends forever. An individual trapped within the confines of SCP-3008-1 wouldn't even realize they've entered an anomalous zone until they tried to locate an exit and leave, at which point they'd find they were already hopelessly lost. The geography of SCP-3008-1 does at least appear to be consistent, so people trapped within are theoretically able to retrace their steps and escape if they haven't already ventured too deep. According to data collected during the drone reconnaissance missions, SCP-3008-2, of which there appear to be a vast population, would wander the stores aimlessly during the day. They are unresponsive to the drone's presence and did not appear to be aggressive. While the physical descriptions of these creatures could vary slightly, they all follow the same overall trend. Clothes consistent with an IKEA uniform, no face, either seemingly too tall or too short, and limbs that are grossly out of proportion with their bodies. As the Foundation began sending drones deeper into SCP-3008-1, they found another incredible discovery. There was an unknown population of humans trapped inside IKEA's anomalous zone, and these people had used the IKEA furniture around them to create entire settlements and towns within the store. There were several of these towns, all of which seemed to cohabitate peacefully. Even Foundation personnel found this development in their research to be truly extraordinary. Since SCP-3008 was first identified, there have been only 14 civilian escapes. Some had been trapped inside for months, others had been in there for years, some far longer than Martin's 3-year stint. While every one of these escapees has eventually been released back to their home, after a liberal application of amnestics and a proper cover story has been devised, the Foundation interviewed each of them extensively first. According to each of these escapees, the people trapped inside the IKEA have built an entirely new society across the various settlements. Contrary to the Lord of the Flies expectations of a group of people isolated and afraid, there's immense cooperation between the trapped civilians. The food in the several IKEA restaurants in SCP-3008-1 mysteriously replenishes while nobody's there, so there's no threat of starving. And the automatic turning on and off of the lights forms as a rudimentary kind of day and night cycle. Nighttime, however, is when things get dangerous, as the SCP-3008-2 entities, which are known to the people inside as the staff, become extremely hostile after dark. Aggressive hordes of the staff swarm the settlements at night, repeating, "This door is now closed, please exit the building." The civilians inside are usually able to repel these attacks with minimal casualties, but the constant war of attrition slowly wears down those inside. The bodies of the creatures also need to be removed from the area after each attack, as the presence of corpses or even parts of corpses has been known to heighten the ferocity of the next night's attack. During the day, the staff return to a docile and unresponsive state, though they'll still defend themselves violently if anyone dares to attack. Over the course of the interviews with the 14 escapees, Foundation researchers were able to answer another of their key questions. How had so many people gone missing in the store for so long without being noticed? But the answer they received only raised many more unsettling queries. According to the escapees, there were people inside the settlements that, despite being otherwise of entirely sound mind and standard intelligence, seemed to lack very common knowledge that even a child should know. For example, some of them weren't aware of the International Space Station orbiting the Earth, or stranger still, the existence of the Statue of Liberty. This led the researchers to a frightening conclusion. SCP-3008-1 may not only be a nexus point of multiple IKEA stores in our dimension, it could be connected to IKEAs in every dimension where IKEAs exist. While it only abducts a handful of people from each store over an extended period of time, it suddenly becomes clear how this SCP was able to trap so many people without detection over such a long period of time, which in turn led to an even more terrifying revelation. The SCP Foundation may not have SCP-3008-1 as contained as they thought. It might even be tucked away in an IKEA store somewhere near you, just waiting for you to visit. After all, there's always room for one more. It's 3 a.m. and the facility is quiet. Office workers and administrators roam the halls. Security officers stand at their posts, clad in advanced tactical armor and carrying standard-issue M4 carbines. 3 Foundation employees sit at flickering monitors watching a live feed of footage from the containment cell of the infamous SCP-106, or as it's referred to by all staff, the Old Man. No Foundation personnel are permitted to travel within 60 feet of the cell for security reasons, and nobody is permitted to physically interact with the anomaly without the approval of 2/3 of O5 Command. The observer's eyes itch and sting from hours of unending blue light exposure, but they can't look away. The Old Man is crafty. He might have the insatiable bloodlust of a hungry great white shark, but he's not mindless. He's a calculating predator, more sadistic than the worst human serial killer, and he's always searching for the next opportunity. According to the Foundation records, he's been active since at least World War II, and it's estimated that he has hundreds if not thousands of victims to his name, and many of those made simple but extremely foolish mistakes of underestimating him. After all, it only takes a few seconds of inattentiveness and the briefest moment of distraction to give him the window he needs. To do what, you ask? Oh, don't worry, you'll find out, just like they did. The Old Man has his nickname for a reason. Most of the time, he really does look exactly like that, an old man, or more specifically an old man's decaying corpse, his body covered in rotten, dark, grayish-black flesh that looks like putrid meat. Though the creature has been observed being able to change shape, the rot seems to run too deep for the Old Man to ever hide it. Foundation employees that have observed SCP-106 for extended periods of time have reported seeing it assume the form of grinning, decayed children and women whose rotted flesh barely hangs on their creaking bones. Just seeing the images through a video feed is enough to cause a lifetime of insomnia and other sleeping issues. Still, they have a job to do and the cameras remain fixed on the Old Man. He's been completely motionless for 3 months, just sitting there like a Buddhist monk in deep meditation. A novice might see this period of inactivity as a cause for celebration, but those with experience know that this is merely the calm before the storm. SCP-106 can remain in a dormant state for months at a time. Described by the Foundation scientists as a lulling state, it's believed that the Old Man is simply waiting for its captors to get soft, make a mistake, or simply have a momentary lapse in concentration, which is all it needs to make its move. It had happened so many times before, and it was about to happen again. One of the observers must have felt an overwhelming wave of anxiety as he saw the creature ever so slightly twitch. Just a tiny quiver in the shoulder muscles, but that was enough to tell the observer that their day had just taken a terrifying turn. He grabbed the emergency phone fixed to his desk and practically screamed into the receiver that 106 is moving, that they need a tactical team stat. But it was already too late. He and the other 2 observers stared into the monitors with their mouths agape as a gooey, rust-like substance began to pool around the creature on the floor of its cell. Slowly, the creature craned its withered neck around. Its face was fixed into a broad, yellow-toothed, lipless grin. Its eyes had the kind of dull, flat malice of an underwater predator. It looked directly into the camera, directly at them, and smiled. The observers knew this was bad. Really, really bad. With what they could have sworn was a little nod, the Old Man began sinking into the rusty puddle it made on the ground beneath it, until it had disappeared entirely. SCP-106 is capable of phasing through any solid surface with ease, making it one of the hardest entities to reliably contain, and earning it a spot on the dreaded Keter class, reserved for the anomalies that are complete nightmares to keep locked up. Through the years of costly research and deadly trial and error, the Foundation would later devise ways of at least slowing the creature down. It's shown to have an aversion to lead, highly complex or random physical structures, and intense bright light. None of these cause harm to the creature, as far as we know, literally nothing can, but they'll at least buy you some precious extra seconds with which to at least try and escape. seconds the three observers didn't have. One of them grabbed an emergency line again and barked into it that they had lost visual on the anomaly. Just then, the observers heard a faint crackling sound behind them and the hissing of a chemical burn. They turned in horror to see a huge rusty burn mark expanding across the wall, right next to the door, which was their only escape route. They backed as far away from the door as they could as a rotten hand began reaching out of the mass of corrosive black sludge, followed by the grinning face of SCP-106, ready to have some fun. Meanwhile, two heavily armed security officers, Agents Goodwin and Resnick, came charging down the corridor toward the observation rooms. It became a bleak slogan during SCP-106 escape attempts that all you need to do is follow the screams, and that motto was proven true that night because awful things were happening to the observation personnel. They were certainly screaming about it. Of course, even with the top-of-the-line firearms, there was little they could do to harm the rampaging old man. He seemed immune to all forms of physical damage. All they could hope to do was keep the thing distracted until the scientists and containment specialists finished the preparations to lure him back into his containment cell. Goodwin surged forward while Resnick covered his six. Vigilance was key, as unlike a standard human combatant, SCP-106 could attack from literally any angle, including above or below. Physical obstacles were irrelevant to him, and no cover was safe. The hardened security officers could see the burn mark on the wall of the observation room as they approached. SCP-106 was perpetually coated in a thick black mucus with powerful corrosive properties that left any surfaces it touched permanently marred. Foundation scientists speculated that this mucus served as a kind of pre-digestive substance that tenderizes meat and bone alike, but to what purpose this serves is a mystery, as the old man has never been observed eating. It's postulated that the only purpose is causing additional pain. Goodwin and Resnick knew to treat this hissing sludge as a potential threat, as the corrosive properties would remain active for as much as 6 hours before finally fizzling out. The two officers shared a quiet nod before Goodwin breached the observation room door with a hard kick. The two of them surged inside, guns at the ready. In their time working at the Foundation, they'd seen some truly horrific sights. From the mutilation of D-Class personnel, typically death row prison inmates brought in for use as SCP guinea pigs, to the violence and mayhem of a containment breach. But there was nothing in their past that would ever make the horrifying sight they saw in the observation room that night feel normal. All three observers were dead. Almost nothing remained of two of them, and the third, while still intact, no longer looked human. He looked like he'd somehow been dead 100 years in the brief period that the old man had been free. His skin was gray and completely dried out, and his mouth was locked into a perpetual scream. It was a massacre, but there was no sign of the old man. Goodwin grabbed his radio and whispered, "This is Goodwin in Observation Room 6, requesting immediate backup. We have no idea where this thing," but his sentence was cut off by a sudden scream from Agent Resnick. SCP Foundation security officers are as tough as nails, the best of the best, you might say, recruited from the top military organizations in the world. So hearing one of them scream in fright is a rare, if not impossible, occurrence. But even they were forced to yell out in fear when they looked up to see the old man standing on the ceiling, grinning down at them. Resnick raised his M4 and shot a 3-round burst at center mass. SCP-106 didn't care. Even under sustained gunfire from the two security officers, it didn't flinch. The old man simply reached down and snatched Agent Resnick from the ground like it was picking an apple from a tree. The old man held Resnick in one hand and pounded its other rotten fist into the agent's body, breaking all of his bones. Resnick screamed for his partner to help him, but there was no time. Before Goodwin could do anything, SCP-106 began receding back into another slimy burn mark on the wall. Only this time, he was taking his screaming victim with him. Agent Resnick gave one more horrified scream before he was pulled backward into the inky darkness, leaving the room silent except for the burning hiss of the corrosive goo left behind. You might think this would be the end of it, but no. For poor Agent Resnick, the worst was yet to come. He was being dragged into what the SCP Foundation scientists refer to as the Old Man's Pocket Dimension, a miniature layer of reality within our own where the malicious SCP is essentially a cruel, all-powerful god. According to witness reports extracted from victims who were taken to this little nightmare realm, the dimension resembles a series of twisting, endless corridors where the old man stalks and tortures his captured victims to the breaking point, manipulating space and time to his own sadistic ends. On rare occasions, the SCP will even release its victims just for the joy of hunting, capturing, and torturing them all over again. While Agent Resnick was learning the true meaning of terror, containment specialists were mobilizing in its cell, preparing the one known, tried and true method of luring the old man back, tempting it with the prospect of causing even more suffering. In order to do this, Foundation personnel take one of the aforementioned Class D personnel and begin inducing extreme pain by breaking a major bone or slicing a tendon every 20 minutes. The victim's agonizing screams are then played over the facility's intercom, acting as bait for the pain-loving old man. The screams echo through the facility's otherwise silent halls as the mutilated corpse of Agent Resnick falls from a new scorch mark on the ceiling. The old man can hear the sounds of suffering ringing out through the air around him, and he can barely contain his excitement over the prospect of a new plaything. The snapped femurs, the torn Achilles tendons, it was all too good to miss. Having had its twisted fun with the security officers and observers, SCP-106 wandered back to its containment cell, where a new screaming victim awaited. The other security officers, containment specialists, and scientists evacuated the area, leaving the old man alone with his prey. While the unfortunate Class D was left to his fate, the rest of the staff commenced cleanup procedures, which mainly involve wiping the brown and black mucus from the walls. It would probably be at least another month before anything like this happened again, and new personnel would be transferred over to the facility to replace the fallen. All in all, just another night at the SCP Foundation.
When an anomaly is first detected by an SCP Foundation field agent, it's up to the Foundation's mobile task forces to tag and bag the impossible entities before they can do any more harm. Sometimes these retrievals are uneventful, other times, not so much. Especially when they're dealing with brutal forces of nature like SCP-096. Also known as the Shy Guy, a creature that, from the very first interaction with the Foundation, had a reputation for being dangerous and needed to be feared. A series of vague sightings and mysterious disappearances up in the frosty mountains of the Yukon first sparked the Foundation's interest. When they were certain that they had an anomaly on their hands, two retrieval teams, Zulu 9A and Zulu 9B, were dispatched to secure and contain the entity. Zulu 9A took the lead in a heavy-duty chopper, equipped with 50 caliber GAU-19 heavy machine guns, and carrying an AT-4 anti-tank launcher. They were prepared for anything, or so they thought, as they established a visual on SCP-096 while 2 clicks away from the target. They couldn't get a clear line of sight on the creature, but it appeared to be stationary, docile, and was making no attempt to flee. Piece of cake, right? Little did they know that SCP-096 was just looking away from them. If it was facing towards them, it'd be a whole different horror story, as Zulu 9A were about to find out. The team landed their helicopter next to the creature and were shocked to see that it was completely naked, in spite of the sub-zero temperatures all around them. The creature was unnaturally thin, as though it had been starved for weeks, with bone-white skin and unnaturally long limbs. The team guessed that the creature's arms must have been at least 1.5 meters long, but its docile nature and insubstantial body mass gave the impression that it wouldn't prove too difficult to contain. That is, until they saw its face. Zulu 9A's captain was the lone survivor of the incident, as he was lucky enough to be looking away when the creature turned towards his team. The rest of the squad ended up staring eye to eye with SCP-096, and from that moment on, wasn't docile anymore. The creature began to whimper, then cry, then sob uncontrollably in a way that sounded eerily human. This sudden change in temperament startled the rest of Zulu 9A, and they opened fire on the creature. Under the hail of gunfire, SCP-096 entered a murderous frenzy and began tearing into the hapless squad of soldiers. While its flesh and organs did seem to take damage as a result of the barrage of 50 caliber rounds from the helicopter-mounted machine guns, its skeletal structure remained intact, and it continued its onslaught, tearing the team limb from limb, even after they'd blown practically all the flesh from the creature. The AT-4 anti-tank launcher proved equally ineffective at stopping SCP-096 while it was in attack mode. And it was only after slaughtering the entire team that it returned to its docile state. Nobody knows exactly what the creature did to Zulu 9A after the gunfire started, but no trace of the team was left behind. Zulu 9B touched down soon after, and with a grave warning from the captain not to look at the creature's face, they were finally able to subdue it. A bag was placed over SCP-096's face, which seemed to soothe it enough to move it to a nearby Foundation facility. Little did they know, they just obtained one of the deadliest SCPs of all time. And while it may have been under lock and key for now, it seemed inevitable that it would get out and cause more violence and chaos. Research and containment procedures for the SCP-096 were put under the command of Dr. Dan, a senior researcher at the site. It was his job to find out exactly what this being was capable of, and the more he tested, the more he realized that they were dealing with something truly terrifying. Disposable D-Class personnel were used to figure out exactly what it was that caused the creature to enter its attack mode. Just as it had during the initial retrieval mission, SCP-096 went berserk when any of the attending personnel saw its face. In this stage, it would enter a period of considerable and unstoppable distress for 1 to 2 minutes, covering its face and wailing loudly. When the period of distress ended, the creature would mercilessly slaughter every D-Class that had seen its face, and just like with Zulu 9A, no trace of their bodies would be left behind. Dr. Den was horrified and intrigued by this phenomenon. The creature killed anyone that saw its face directly, but could the same be said for indirect depictions of the creature's face, such as images and videos? Dr. Dan was desperate to find out. More D-Class personnel were brought in to test this, to frightening results. Dr. Dan found that the creature did indeed still enter attack mode when people saw pictures and videos of SCP-096's face. The creature seemed to have an innate sense of when people were viewing these representations, even when it should have had no conceivable way of knowing. It didn't matter how far away or how many barriers were in place between the viewer and the creature, the attack mode would still activate. And once it did, it seemed as though nothing could stop the creature from hunting down the one who saw its face. With all of this new data, special containment procedures were devised to keep the creature safely under lock and key. Its cell was a 5 meter by 5 meter by 5 meter airtight steel cube, fitted with advanced pressure sensors and laser detectors to ensure that SCP-096 remained in its cell without risking anyone having visual contact with the creature's face. All cameras and video equipment were strictly forbidden, and weekly checks for any cracks or holes in the containment cell were mandatory. Of course, none of this would stop the creature if anyone somehow saw its face. In order to solve that little problem, Dr. Dan would need to continue his research. To find a method of subverting the creature's deadly glance, they needed to know exactly what they were dealing with. But how could they, when even a glance at a photo or video of the being meant certain death? A potential solution was proposed, creating an artistic representation of the creature's face, something that hadn't yet been attempted. But how would they achieve such a feat? Simple. They'd procure a D-Class prisoner with some artistic talent, and they found one who had been a tattoo artist before becoming a Foundation guinea pig. Dr. Dan formulated an ingenious plan for keeping this D-Class alive for long enough to accurately draw an image of SCP-096's face. He would be placed in a bathysphere diving bell several kilometers underwater and tens of kilometers away from the containment cell where the SCP was being held. The D-Class was made to look at a photograph of the creature's face and then replicate that image in a pencil sketch. Dr. Dan first confirmed that the creature's attack mode is only activated by the creature's face by having the D-Class look at a series of photos of the SCP's body parts, one by one, finally finishing with its face. The D-Class began drawing and even remarked on how creepy the SCP's facial features were, despite not knowing the deadly context. Meanwhile, back in its containment cell, SCP-096 sensed someone viewing its face and entered its inconsolable crying state followed by its attack mode. It broke out of containment easily and began making a beeline for the D-Class, traversing the miles between it and its prey. The D-Class didn't know it, as he locked the finished drawing into a separate, autonomous submersible, but he was already dead. As the drawing made its way up to a researcher on the surface, SCP-096 dived into the water and started swimming down towards the artist. Minutes later, the bathysphere was breached, and the D-Class was torn to shreds. SCP-096 was recaptured without issue by Surface Recovery Team Foxtrot 303A, and further testing on the drawing showed that artistic representations of SCP-096's face were in fact harmless. From this experience, we now know that the creature has a gaunt face with totally white eyes, possibly indicating blindness and a grossly extended jaw. Nevertheless, Dr. Dan was adamant that SCP-096 was too dangerous to be left alive, and requested permission from the upper echelons of the Foundation to terminate the creature by any means necessary. However, the doctor's request would fall on deaf ears, until it all started with a seemingly innocent image. While it's now been redacted for your safety, the black speck inside the yellow circle was once a minuscule image of SCP-096, taken unknowingly in the 1990s by a semi-professional mountaineer. One day they were looking at old photographs when his eyes passed over the tiny speck without even noticing that he had seen anything. But SCP-096 noticed and began entering its attack mode. It tore through its steel containment unit like tissue paper, causing the release of a nerve agent that killed a number of attending Foundation staff. The monster then fled the base and began pursuing its prey, with Mobile Task Force Tau 1 in hot pursuit. Dr. Alexei, who was helping to manage the site where the SCP was contained, was in dismay over the situation. Dr. Dan was out of the country at the time, trying to discover more about the creature's origins. However, he did leave the Mobile Task Force with a new secret weapon against the rampaging Shy Guy: Project Scramble. Scramble were state-of-the-art goggles featuring a new technology created by Dr. Dan, which, using artistic renditions of 096's facial features, could detect and scramble the features of SCP-096 into an unrecognizable form, preventing the normally deadly effect of gazing upon its face. In theory, this would allow MTF Tau 1 to engage safely with 096 once its prey had been eliminated and bring it back into containment. But disaster struck on two fronts. First, the prey in question was located in a population center, creating the potential for a huge loss of life. And the second bigger problem was that the scramble technology didn't work, as stray pixels of the creature's face would reach the eyes of the task force before the internal microprocessor had time to scramble them. The mission turned into a death sentence, as SCP-096 slaughtered almost the entire task force, as well as a number of civilians in town, including an infant and its entire family. It was a monumental disaster, made even worse by a final revelation. Dr. Dan and Dr. Alexei had themselves facilitated the entire containment breach and allowed the resulting massacre to happen, with Dr. Dan hoping it would be enough motivation for Foundation Command to greenlight his research into destroying the creature. Anything that would give him the opportunity to kill this thing would be worth the bloodshed. His plan worked, and the SCP Foundation saw it his way, approving his request to neutralize SCP-096. However, success comes at a cost for Dr. Dan. Once he figures out a way to finally kill the creature, though done in his line of duty, he himself will be terminated by the Foundation for his crimes against humanity. But considering how much damage SCP-096 is capable of causing if it ever got to a major population center, or even worse, was ever caught on camera and broadcast to a worldwide audience, the Doctor himself would likely deem his own death a justifiable cost. To this day, the Foundation is researching ways to kill the creature, and they're still looking for their silver bullet. And the pressure is on. They hadn't known about the seemingly innocent picture that sparked the last containment breach, the one taken decades ago, in which the Shy Guy had only occupied 4 tiny pixels. 4 tiny pixels that resulted in multiple innocent lives lost. So be careful where you look, because who knows how many other photos of the creature are lurking out there. Photos with an innocent dot in the background. Your eyes glance over it, not even noticing the little blip, until you hear a distant wailing that seems to be getting closer and closer and closer, and then it's already too late.
Every time a bell rings, an angel gets its wings. It's an iconic line from It's a Wonderful Life, and even if you don't believe in angels, it is a pleasant image. After all, angels are the embodiment of goodness and light, so an angel getting its wings has to be a good thing, right? Well, as anyone who's ever eaten one too many Christmas cookies can tell you, it's possible to have too much of a good thing. Even something that sounds like the embodiment of all things good in theory can become deadly when taken to the extreme. That is where SCP-469, also known as the Many-Winged Angel, comes in. This angel-like creature is anything but innocent, and in fact it has been responsible for multiple deaths of SCP Foundation personnel during its captivity. SCP-469 may be deadly, but it is also undeniably beautiful in a mysterious, ethereal way. When first seen, it appears to be nothing more than a massive pile of pristine white feathers, like something out of a pillow commercial. The pile measures 24 feet in diameter and weighs at least 2 tons. However, like many of the entities contained within the walls of the Foundation's countless containment sites, all is not as it seems with 469. What looks at first glance to be a pile of feathers is in fact a dense, curled mass of giant wings. The wings vary in size from the tiny wingspan of a sparrow to the staggering 3.6-meter wingspan of the wandering albatross. The one thing they have in common is their plumage, with each wing being covered with the same glossy white feathers. The Foundation was able to perform a series of X-rays on the massive wings, revealing a skeletal structure beneath the feathers. Like those of a bird, the wings' bones are hollow. However, they are unnaturally soft and flexible, allowing for a range of motion that no known bird possesses. This accounts for the curvature of the wings and their ability to coil tightly into each other. The X-ray also provided the first and only recorded glimpse at the creature hiding underneath all the feathers. At the center of the layers upon layers of wings is a humanoid creature curled into a fetal position. In defiance of the laws of natural anatomy, every single wing appears to be fused to this creature's spine. How would it be able to move under the weight of these wings, or even if it could, is as of yet unknown. The first Foundation personnel lost to SCP-469 were D-Class personnel D-112 and D-624, who were sent in to investigate the nature of the creature and attempt to contact the humanoid entity identified on the X-rays. 112 and 624 entered the room, equipped with gloves and protective eye gear, as scientists watched the situation unfold on a monitor on a video feed. No one expected much to come of the encounter. The working hypothesis was the layers of feathers would simply be too thick to get through without seriously damaging the bones. It would be a fairly uneventful experiment, or so they thought. 112 approached SCP-469 first, and attempted to part a section of its feathers with his hands as 624 stood back and observed. The moment his fingertips touched the feathers, a rustling sound filled the room. The feathers began to quiver, shaking as if all waking up at once from a deep slumber. Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, the hundreds and hundreds of wings unfurled and pulled 112 into their depths. He was swept into a swirl of feathers, and within seconds, he had disappeared from view completely. Though 624 and the scientists watching on their monitor could no longer see him, they could certainly hear him. From the moment the wings pulled him into the sea of feathers, 112 had begun to scream in agony. His screams persisted, growing louder and more desperate even as the voice cracked and grew weak. 624 stood, frozen in place with fear and shock. 624 was ordered to attempt to retrieve 112 from the feathers, but made no move to do so. He simply stared at the feathers, eyes wide, face pale, as the pained shrieks of his colleague bounced off the sterile white walls of the containment room. A guard called over the intercom, threatening to terminate 624 if he did not attempt to remove 112 from SCP-469's grasp. This warning seemed to shock 624 back into action, and he made a run for the center feathers, arms up to protect his face. Again, the sound of rustling as the feathers began to quake. The wings unfurled once more, and 624 did not even have a chance to turn back before he was pulled in to meet the same dismal fate as the other D-Class. His screams of pain joined 112 as the scientists watching over the monitor could do nothing to help them. As the two men cried out in pain and horror from within their winged prison, something began to happen that the scientists had never seen before. The feathers started to shake again, faster than before, and at first the wings appeared to be unfolding again. Upon second look, though, it was clear they hadn't moved. There were simply more of them now. As the men continued to scream, more feathers appeared, the wings stretching out and elongating as new wings sprouted as if from nowhere. SCP-469 appeared to be feeding on the sound of their screams, and using that energy to expand. It was only after several long minutes when the screaming finally stopped that the growth of the wings did too. At this point, the wings shifted again, expelling the bodies of 112 and 624 from within its folds, dropping them limply on the ground. Though their deaths were unfortunate, the loss of 112 and 624 did reveal some new information about SCP-469. First, that it could grow, and apparently needed to feed on sounds in order to do so. Second, that it was deadly to humans, and most likely to other living things as well. Autopsies of 112 and 624's corpses would later reveal exactly what happened to them, and how SCP-469 kills its prey. Though 469's feathers may look as though they would be soft to the touch, each feather is actually made up of sharp barbs that are capable of piercing clothing and skin. These barbs release a neurotoxin into the system that activates every pain receptor in the body of the victim. The neurotoxin present in these feathers has not been identified anywhere else in nature, but is somewhat similar in structure and function to the neurotoxins excreted by the cone snail and in the bite of the blue-ringed octopus. In addition to the pain-inducing neurotoxin, the feathers also carry several unidentified stimulant compounds, where the neurotoxin on its own would induce enough pain for the affected party to pass out almost immediately. The stimulants serve to keep the victim conscious. SCP Foundation scientists posit that this is so that 469 can get as much noise, in this case in the form of screams, out of its pain as possible, and achieve maximum growth before the captive creature dies or goes into shock. Further experiments confirm this theory and show that SCP-469 will react similarly when exposed to any living creature capable of making a sound and experiencing pain, not just humans. Non-living matter, though, including dead animals, elicit no response from 469. Additional experiments were then undertaken that involved applying various different sounds in order to test their effect on SCP-469's growth. Though it feeds on any sounds produced in its presence, it seems to respond most strongly to musical sounds, exhibiting a particularly strong response to classical music. No sound elicits a stronger reaction from this creature, however, than the sound of ringing bells. It is rumored that when a bell was rung in the presence of 469, the humanoid at the center of the feathers is said to have moved for the first time on record. Apparently, whatever is at the center appeared to wake up and unfurl its wings, revealing itself. But unfortunately, all security footage of this incident has been wiped, and the data has been expunged from the record, leaving the creature's true form a mystery. You may be remembering that 4 members of Foundation personnel on record were lost to SCP-469, and that only 2 have been mentioned so far. The second pair of casualties resulted when the Foundation attempted to terminate SCP-469, believing that there was no more scientific benefit to keeping it alive, or at least that the possible benefits did not outweigh the risks. It was ordered that SCP-469 be terminated by any means necessary. 2 skilled personnel, Dr. Jones and Dr. Smith, were sent into the containment facility in hazmat gear, armed with several sharp instruments. They were to attempt to use these to cut through the forest of feathers and soft bones until they could reach the humanoid at the center. It was presumed that once they did, and the creature no longer had the protection of its poisonous feathers, that it would be relatively easy to kill. They could not have been more wrong. Dr. Jones approached the dense cover of feathers with a pair of sharpened gardening shears, while Dr. Smith opted for a machete. At first, the strategy appeared to be working. Dr. Jones made several quick cuts, with feathers fluttering to the floor and sticking to the hazmat suit as Dr. Smith slashed into the feathers with his machete, making similarly promising progress. However, the situation quickly took a turn for the worse when Dr. Jones dropped her shears and let out a blood-curdling scream. The feathers had taken a little longer to get through the suit to her skin, but somehow they managed to find a way just the same. Smith grabbed Jones and attempted to make a break for it, but he was too slow and far too close to the feathers already. The wings wrapped around them and swallowed them both up, leaving the researchers outside helpless to do anything but listen to their screams and wait for them to go quiet. After several minutes, they finally did, and now larger SCP-469 had officially claimed another 2 Foundation personnel. Obviously, 469 could not be terminated using any methods that would place the responsible personnel within its grasp. That was simply too risky. So the Foundation selected a team of D-Class personnel to attempt to burn the feathers with an array of flamethrowers. Though the feathers were vulnerable to fire and began to blacken and disintegrate on contact, the sound of the flames being expelled was loud enough to feed SCP-469. Its growth was so quick in response to the noise that the fire could not keep up with the amount of new feathers and wings being produced. By the same time the flamethrowers ran out of propellant, 469 was the same size it had been when they started. Other terminations have been discussed, including the possibility of submerging the entire creature in a highly corrosive acid, but so far this has not yet been attempted. Whatever they end up trying, it is clear that nothing that produces a significant amount of noise will be able to kill 469. So where is it now? What's become of this perverse angel with the never-ending wings? Currently, it is kept in an airtight, soundproof chamber where nothing can trigger the growth of any more wings. So, what is it? An angel? A demon? A twisted, mutated bird of some kind? It is entirely possible that we will never know. But It's a Wonderful Life had something right, even by accident. Every time a bell rings, something, twisted and deadly though it may be, gets its wings.
We were a team, despite our differences, in spite of the terrible things they'd done. We were still a team. That's not how the higher-ups saw it, though. No, the guys upstairs with their perfectly pressed shirts. For them, we were judged by our level of expendability, and they knew that our next mission was a death sentence. One by one, that thing took out my team, my friends, snapping their necks so quickly and with such ease that no sooner did I hear the scream, they were dead. We had been used. I'd been used. Delivered as prey to the predator. A plot that was sanctioned by the bosses and approved with a blood-red stamp. Why did they do it? I'm still trying to figure that out. Maybe that's something you can tell me after you hear how these so-called scientific men left us in this cell. And in the hands of SCP-173. For me, it had been the best of times before it became the worst of times. The best because I'd quickly risen through the ranks of the facility. The worst because, well, I'll get to that. I was never the best student. I finished high school by the skin of my teeth, and my job prospects looked bleak. But I was lucky, I guess. Or at least I thought so at the time. You see, I have an uncle Siegfried who did some work for the government. I never actually knew what he did, just that it was secretive work. I used to imagine he was some sort of super spy, so you can imagine how excited I was when he found out I needed a job and he offered to help me out. I couldn't believe it. I always thought he hated me. I'd overheard him telling my parents that I was a no-good deadbeat, but now he'd had a change of heart and was willing to take me under his wing. What would I get to do? Undercover intelligence gathering? International assassinations? Just you wait, he said. And that's how I found myself walking into a sprawling, futuristic-looking facility where they handed me a level 1 security clearance card with big, bold letters that read, Janitor. But I was happy. Just the words security clearance made me feel important, and it beat flipping burgers. I pushed mops, turned off lights, fired up generators, clocked in and clocked out. But all that time they must have been watching me, grooming me, waiting for the day they could throw me to the wolves. I should have known. I've always been an expendable kind of guy. After a few years, I was called to an office, and there was a man in a plaid shirt and kind of a tweed jacket that professors wear. He asked me, "Do you have any idea about what we actually do here?" And to be honest, I didn't. I knew that there were many parts of the facility I couldn't enter. I imagined that down a maze of corridors were weapons being built, or prisoners being interrogated. But I had no idea about the anomalies. How could I? Before I was told anything, I had to sign a bunch of forms. There were so many I thought I'd get to find out who really killed JFK. And while they didn't come out and say it, what I inferred was that if I ever talk about what happens at the facility to someone outside the facility, well, let's just say it's not the kind of thing they'd spell out on a piece of paper, but it involves padded cells and rusty tools. I wasn't scared though. I was part of something big, something secret, and I loved it. So I signed my life away with no hesitation. Soon after, I was introduced to my first anomaly, the safe class, of course. They took me to an observation room, and from that room I could see into another room with a sign on the wall that read SCP-067. I just stood there, waiting for something to happen, when in walked another guy in a white lab coat. "Welcome to your first anomaly," he said. "Is it okay if I hook you up to this heart monitor? We want to gauge your reaction to what you see." "All I can see," I told him, "is an empty room with a table and what looks like a pen on top of some papers." "Correct," he said, half smiling, as if I was some kind of idiot. "That's SCP-067. I thought about telling him that if I needed years of training before I could see a pen, that I probably should have taken that fast food job. Could have been a shift manager by now. Then they brought a young chimpanzee into the room, small enough to be harmless. One of the guys forced a pen into the scared chimp's hand and something strange happened. It started scribbling. Nonsense at first, but suddenly it was sketching and drawing faster and faster. I could catch glimpses of words and images. By the time they dragged it out, it was flailing around like it was possessed. "That pen has power," said the man in the lab coat. "A power whose source or origin we don't fully understand. That's why we're here. That's why you are here." One of the guys in the other room held the chimp's drawing up to the window. It was a perfect sketch of the Tower of London, intricate and brilliant.
Above the sketch was the title Tower of London, Tudor Period, circa 1541. The year Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, lost her head on the chopping block. Underneath that, the chimp had written, "Pity. She was no traitor." Take it from me, I was there. They didn't need to look at the heart rate monitor to see that I was shocked. That was far from the only anomaly I'd come into contact with, and I must have been doing something right, because in time I went from level 1 to 2 to level 3 security clearance, and that's when they made me a containment specialist. I won't bore you with all the details, but as you can guess, I dealt with the containment of anomalies. A lot of my time was spent looking through small windows and cell doors, making sure that whatever was inside and still in one piece. Other times I worked with field agents when anomalies were brought in, a transition period that the arrested freaks didn't much like. There was one certain anomaly, though, that I was tasked to oversee on many occasions. I like to think of it as my pet, but in hindsight, I was its pet. This was SCP-173, something that was in what we call the Euclid class, a classification meaning that we don't fully understand it, but know it is very dangerous. We know it's intelligent, we know it's unpredictable, and we know it will kill. And for that reason, there's people tasked with containing it and keeping an eye on it at all times. At first glance, you wouldn't guess just how dangerous 173 is. You wouldn't think it's incredibly intelligent. In fact, you'd think the opposite. That's because it's more or less a walking slab of concrete and rebar with stunted limbs and traces of spray paint that give the impression of a dopey face. We have to enter its cell twice a week for cleaning duties. It leaves a disgusting, foul-smelling liquid on the floor, a reddish-brown substance that I can only describe as a mix of blood and waste products. Where that stuff comes from has remained a mystery since we first contained it in 1993. Going into the cell was always a three-man job because, and this is maybe the weirdest part about 173, it can't move if human eyes are watching it. That's why you need at least 2 people watching it at all times. If you were in the room watching 173 by yourself and blinked, you'd be dead before your eyes opened. We don't know how it moves that fast, but in that fraction of a second, your neck is snapped so hard it's almost like being decapitated. I've seen the videos to prove it. All it took was a sneeze. He wasn't even finished getting the rest of the achoo out when there was a flash and his partner was left lying on the ground. His head twisted around the wrong direction. So, you can understand why we now require 3 men for any time we must enter 173's cell. Then, a few months ago, I was told that a long process would begin to train and re-educate some future Class Ds. Class Ds are mostly prisoners with lifelong sentences, or those we've taken from death row and given a new lease on life. We were apparently understaffed, so why not employ these men whose lives had pretty much ended anyway? That was the rationale, or at least that's what they told me. I was told to train them on their new job, mopping up 173's mess, so that me and the rest of the containment specialists could focus on more important tasks. They hadn't been through the training I had, seen what I had seen. But after showing them the video of 173 nearly taking off a man's head, they were more than willing to follow the rules. They understood not to blink or turn away or sneeze, and that any lapse in focus could lead to a violent death. So I started to show them the ropes, how we move as a team into the cell and always keep the others informed on what we're doing. 173 was always sitting in the corner of a cell, no expression on that crude face. But when we walked in its cell, I got the feeling it knew something had changed. I felt almost as if it was communicating with me, but I couldn't tell what it was trying to say. And then, it happened. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days from the last time we'd cleaned. As usual, 173 had covered the floor with that horrible liquid. We headed in to clean, my new team alert as always, and some of them cleaned while others kept their eyes focused on the thing in the corner. Things were going smoothly when we heard a noise I knew very well. It was the sound of the cell door locking. Someone must have screwed up. "Hey guys, we're locked in here," I shouted through the intercom. Nothing. "Guys, the damn door is locked." Nothing. I lost it a bit. "Open the door, will you?" Nothing. My team looked at me. The ones not on eye contact duty, that is, as if I should know what to do, hoping that this had happened before and that there was some kind of standard plan to deal with it. There wasn't. We were always observed when in the room, and I knew that a technician couldn't accidentally lock the door. It was impossible. There were protocols. Someone had done this on purpose. The four of us sat in the corner of the room as far from 173 as possible, our eyes locked on it. It didn't move an inch as usual, just stood, staring at the wall as it always did. We stayed awake through the night, talking a little, holding on to the slim hope that something had gone wrong. But as night turned to day again, we all began to lose hope. We weren't sent here to clean. We were a test. Totally expendable. Lab rats. But I wouldn't go down without a fight. We couldn't just stay up forever. That was a death sentence. I suggested that two of us stand, one sit and rest, and one get some sleep. We'd take shifts. A couple hours on, a couple hours off. Maybe we could show that we wouldn't give up. They'd have time to realize what they were doing was insane, call off the test, and come free us. We made it through a couple of shifts like this, and it seemed like we'd actually be able to make it another day or two when everything went wrong. It was my turn to sit and rest when I heard the worst possible noise. Snoring. The con next to me was sleeping quietly, so it must be one of the standers. I glanced over for just a split second and saw both of them, leaning against the cell wall, dozing. At the same time, I saw the flash. Crack, snap, pop. One after another, their necks were snapped. I'm not sure how it happened, but I was standing again, staring at 173, who was now in the corner. Dead bodies with their heads twisted around piled up in front of it. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't stare at this thing forever. I felt myself giving up. I lowered my head to the ground and then finally broke my gaze, ready to die. And then, nothing happened. I slowly raised my head back up and there it was, its hideous face inches away from mine. It was then that I understood what we'd been containing, what we'd underestimated. I felt it again, like it was telling me something. It was telling me to close my eyes, to sleep. So I did. But as my eyes closed, I didn't see darkness. I saw 173, or something like it, but not in the cell. I saw it outside, in the world, standing over children sleeping in their beds, watching. I saw them hiding in the shadows, staring out at passers-by. Then I realized they weren't watching, waiting to pounce. No, they were hiding. My eyes popped open as the door opened and in rushed 6 security personnel. They took me outside, jabbed my leg with a syringe, injecting me with something as the world faded away. Incident report. Time and date redacted. Following the experimental forced interaction with Euclid class anomaly SCP-173, subject has ceased responding to external stimuli and appears to have taken on the traits and behaviors of the anomaly. Subject now spends entire day sitting in corner of cell staring at the wall. Staff are advised to proceed with caution when dealing with subject, as the only behavior they engage in is an attempt to strangle anyone who enters the cell. No treatments have shown any effectiveness, and subject will unfortunately require incarceration, likely forever.
The fabric of our world is littered with strange doorways if you know where to look for them. Tears, portals, anomalies, all leading to places and planes beyond human imagining and understanding. And SCP-2317, otherwise known as a door to another world, certainly fits that description. Contained and kept at all times under the watch of armed guards, SCP-2317 appears to be a simple and unsuspecting wooden door in its frame. It hardly looks like it requires such extreme round-the-clock security, or needs a strange, secretive ritual that the Foundation performs, presumably to keep the door closed. But of course, sometimes the most interesting thing about a closed doorway isn't where it leads, it's what it keeps out. Even by the Foundation's already high standards, the requirements and regulations for personnel who are assigned to SCP-2317 seem oddly specific. Psychological testing is standard practice to work for the Foundation, but an additional hurdle that anyone has to clear before even getting to glimpse at this unassuming wooden door is having a score of at least 72 on the Milgram Obedience Examination. It is also mandatory that personnel assigned to maintaining it are both unmarried, with no children or next of kin, as well as an unwavering, unquestioning loyalty to the Foundation, pure devotion to its code and objectives. These may seem like strange requirements. After all, SCP-2317 is just a door, isn't it? Perhaps there's a reason that the Foundation keeps so much of the information about SCP-2317 buried deep under layers upon layers of security, with only the Overseer Council privy to the full details of its strange nature. Knowledge, as they say, is power. But maybe knowing too much about whatever is behind that door can prove deadly. Still, if SCP-2317 is a door to another world, an alternate dimension, or parallel reality, it must be safe enough to visit. After all, the Foundation has been sending personnel in there on a regular basis. Daily, in fact. According to the O5 Council, this is done as part of a procedure to maintain active containment of something lurking beyond that old wooden doorframe. But what could possibly warrant such constant maintenance and surveillance? In accordance with the Foundation's guidelines, all staff are required to rotate out of observing SCP-2317 after every 2 months, and spend the following 3rd month in full psychological counseling before they are permitted to return to the containment unit housing the door to another world. It was after one of these month-long periods of evaluation that a Foundation guard was informed that his security clearance has been raised to level 3, and that he'd been selected for the duty of carrying out 220 Calabasas. He knew the name instantly. This was the title given to the daily containment procedure that absolutely had to be carried out. The guard didn't question these orders. After all, he'd been selected precisely because of his loyalty to the Foundation. He did make one request to his commanding officer, however. He wanted to know what had happened to the last guard that had performed the procedure. "Didn't make it out of psychological evaluation," the officer replied. Not letting this affect his dedication, the guard was told to prepare for procedure 220 Calabasas. Along with a fellow member of Foundation security personnel, the guard was instructed to gather everything on a strange list. The first was a pre-selected member of Class D personnel, specifically a convicted murderer. Class D refers to disposable class personnel, expendable individuals recruited by the Foundation for the sole purpose of testing SCPs. Class Ds were usually prison inmates repurposed for SCP testing, and the one chosen for 220 Calabasas was no exception, serving multiple life sentences for murders, or at least that's what the guard had been told. A Foundation personnel member instructed him to refer to the Class Ds solely as the assistant from that point on. Next, the guard collected a live chicken, an obsidian-edged knife, a silver aspergillum and aspersorium, to be filled with 500 cc's of holy water that had been blessed by a priest of the Abrahamic faith, and finally, a 1 kiloton nuclear device, which according to instructions was only to be detonated in the unlikely event of a catastrophic containment failure. In other words, the last resort. After following his instructions to the letter and without question, the guard and his colleague were briefed. The Foundation personnel member informed them that he'd be joining and leading them in the procedure. The staff member also specified that henceforth he'd be referred to as the celebrant until the completion of 220 Calabasas. The guard was acutely aware of how specific these instructions were, but trusted in the Foundation, knowing that if they wanted this procedure performed a certain way, then it was in everyone's best interest to carry out the orders to the letter. But what the celebrant then went on to explain raised far more questions about SCP-2317 and the nature of Procedure 220 Calabasas. The Class D joining them wasn't actually a Class D. The assistant, as they were now referred to, was in reality another Foundation staff member, with a Level 4 security clearance specifically tailored to SCP-2317. Every member of staff entering through SCP-2317 and taking an active role in 22 Calabasas needed to be informed that this assistant was not to be harmed or treated as a member of disposable class. Fighting back the nagging question of why the Foundation would employ this subterfuge, the guard, along with his fellow security officer, the celebrant, and assistant, prepared for their departure through the door to another world at solar noon, when the sun was highest over SCP-2317. Solar noon, chickens, and holy water. This all seemed like an oddly occult combination for the Foundation. As they entered the old wooden door, beyond lay a barren salt plain, stretching out for kilometers in every direction. This alternate dimension, according to the briefing, was designated SCP-2317 Prime. The guard immediately noticed a ring of 7 pillars directly ahead of the group as they entered. each of them bearing intricately detailed engravings unlike anything from any era of ancient history. Procedure 220 Calabasas was carried out quickly but carefully, the guard watching as the celebrant and assistant were careful not to miss a step. First, the celebrant scattered holy water into the center of the pillars with the aspergillum and aspersorium, looking down at his feet and keeping a steady pace as he stepped counterclockwise around them. The guard watched intently as the celebrant completed his circuit around the pillars and turned to the assistant, anointing his head with holy water. 7 seals, 7 rings, 7 thrones for the Scarlet King, he said aloud. The assistant, with the obsidian blade in his hand, took the chicken and dispatched it in sacrifice, letting its blood mix with the holy water. He then repeated the celebrant's circuit in the opposite direction before stepping into the center of the stone pillars. Blood for the old gods, water for the new king, the assistant recited, pouring the remaining mix of blood and holy water over a patch of salt in the middle of the 7 pillars. Even though he knew it wasn't his place to question the foundation, as the 220 Calabasas procedure took place, the guard couldn't help but wonder what all this was for. It seemed so ritualistic, like something deeply religious or even magical. He never bought into all that occult mumbo-jumbo, even while working for the Foundation. But he had learned not to question anything, even the strangest and most inexplicable of sights. Little did he know that beneath his feet was an ancient and unknowable horror, a beast chained and lying in wait. Contained in a chamber directly underneath the pillars sat an impossibly large creature. Humanoid and obese, its body covered entirely in scales thicker than armor plating. Branch-like horns protruded from its jawless head, pointing up to chains that hung from the 7 pillars above, each one hooked into the entity's back. All but one of the chains was broken, a final withering shackle keeping the Devourer of Worlds in its underground prison. Ever since 1894 BCE, when Ereksian mystics imprisoned it, the Devourer has been waiting patiently for its inevitable freedom. It knows, as well as the Foundation, that nothing can be done to prevent the final chain from one day breaking. Even Procedure 220 Calabasas won't keep the creature contained. It's nothing more than a smokescreen, an act designed to create an illusion of active containment and maintain Foundation morale until a permanent solution can be devised to keep SCP-2317 imprisoned. Of course, if the guard had known this, it would have also explained the need for a 1-kiloton nuclear device as part of this staged ritual. Procedure 220 Calabasas had all the components to trick everyone below the O5 Council, emulating religious and occult rituals, the increased level of security surrounding the procedure and its purpose, and telling staff that any failure to correctly and completely perform the 220 Calabasas procedure will result in an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario. All these elements work together to conceal the truth that one day the Devourer will escape and lay waste to our dimension. Knowledge is power, and maybe knowing too much truly is deadly. Perhaps if the guard had learned any of this, he'd have understood why his predecessor never made it out of psychological evaluation. Maybe if he had questioned the purpose of Procedure 220 Calabasas, he'd have learned the true nature of SCP-2317 and what that doorway kept out. But he was loyal to the Foundation through and through. As the team finished performing 220 Calabasas and returned through the wooden door, the guard took one last glance over his shoulder at the vast salt plain. The entire dimension was calm, silent, but not peaceful. It was patient. The entity had waited centuries for its time, and now all it would take was the breaking of this 7th and final chain. One day. The door was closed behind the guard as he, the celebrant, the assistant, and his fellow security officers stepped back through. Their work done and, as far as they knew, preventing catastrophe for another day. Only the Foundation higher-ups, the Overseer Council, are aware of the true danger posed by SCP-2317 and its sole inhabitant. Current predictions are that at some point within the next 30 years, the Devourer of Worlds will be freed. Any and all attempts to repair or recreate the chains holding it in place have so far failed. As such, the O5 Council has elected to continue providing Foundation personnel with the ignorant hope that Procedure 220 Calabasas is an effective strategy for containment. As we've said, sometimes the most interesting thing about a closed door isn't where it leads, it's what it keeps out. In the case of SCP-2317, the unassuming wooden door holds at bay an ancient creature of untold power that will one day break free and wreak havoc in our dimension. Nothing the Foundation does can prevent it, or keep it contained behind the door to another world. And only the Overseer Council knows that any and all efforts to do so are futile. With all that in mind, we can only hope that the doorway of SCP-2317 stays closed, at least for a little while longer.
Cast your mind back to the height of the Cold War. The ever-accelerating nuclear arms race brought us closer than ever before to making the nightmare of nuclear Armageddon a terrifying reality. The two main parties in this conflict are the United States and Soviet Union, each amassing huge amounts of nuclear warheads and jumping on any available advantage they can over their enemies. What you may not know is that in order to detect an impending attack from the United States, the Soviets developed what would become known to the West as the Dead Hand. But this experimental piece of technology also had another name, SCP-1984. It is no secret that the Soviet Union feared the threat of US nuclear strikes and invasion just as much as the US feared an attack from them. So SCP-1984 was created to act as a deterrent mechanism, specifically against secure second strikes. Secure second strikes were both a deterrent and overwhelming concern during the Cold War, referring to a country's ability after suffering an initial nuclear attack to still retaliate, firing on their enemy and causing untold damage with their own arsenal of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union knew that any action they made that could be perceived as an attack on United States soil would be threatened with nuclear retaliation, and that if they fired first, America would return fire and potentially annihilate them with a second strike. SCP-1984 was to be an automated system that would activate in response to the destruction of the Soviets' main command and control structure. Given that the Dead Hand was created during the 80s, you might be forgiven for expecting a nuclear detection system built at this point in history to consist of various sensors connected to a computer network. But you have also probably already realized that if this was the case, then the Foundation wouldn't be so interested in it. In actuality, SCP-1984 is a fully autonomous entity rather than a network of sensors for detecting incoming nuclear strikes, or a computer capable of initiating a second strike. Perhaps what makes the Foundation more interested in the Dead Hand is that it is both self-aware and links simultaneously to every single one of Russia's nuclear launch sites. Not only this, but SCP-1984 also has direct access to every single one of the atomic weapons stockpiled by the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and is capable of launching intercontinental ballistic missiles at a moment's notice. In short, SCP-1984 could very easily and horrifyingly quickly trigger an all-out nuclear war, resulting in the extinction of all life on Earth. No wonder the Foundation considers the Dead Hand such a massive threat. SCP-1984 itself actually consists of the preserved remains of a Russian soldier by the name of Sergeant Marat Chernikov, who was killed during the Soviet-Afghan War in 1982. Most of the official documentation of Chernikov's existence has been expunged by the Russian Federation, and he is only referred to in fragmented documents recovered by the Foundation that refer to a Project December. These remains serve as the location of a semi-sentient consciousness that has been classified as SCP-1984-01. When it remains dormant and is not interfered with, SCP-1984-01 has the ability to receive and process any signal broadcast to it, and is able to decipher information combined in any signal it picks up. However, when global military tensions start to climb, especially when those tensions affect the Russian Federation, or what were once the satellite states of the former Soviet Union, the entity begins to manifest itself in the physical world. and usually in various strange and different ways. SCP-1984-01 has been known to appear in the real world in forms such as a humanoid outline or a bright red specter taking the shape of a child with its legs cut off. Regardless of which shape it appears in, it is when the dead hand manifests in a more physical form that the wider scope of its abilities become clear. As mentioned previously, it can influence and even launch nuclear weapons, overriding their command systems and bypassing launch sequences. After appearing fully, SCP-1984-01 will travel at speeds of up to 140 kilometers an hour, directly to the nearest military installation capable of launching intercontinental ballistic missiles. Once it reaches its destination, SCP-1984-01 will immediately attempt to override the necessary systems to initiate a launch. After firing missiles at their predetermined targets, SCP-1984-01 will hastily travel to another facility housing nuclear ordnance, repeating the process until it has successfully launched all of Russia's atomic weapons. When engaged, the physical manifestation of SCP-1984 is highly aggressive, and will lethally defend itself against anyone that it observes trying to interfere with it or stop it from causing a nuclear launch. The entity has displayed the ability to disrupt the nervous system, causing excruciating pain and debilitating damage to human beings. Its only known weakness, if any, is a susceptibility to microwave radiation. Although exposure to this does not seem to cause any lasting damage to SCP-1984, instead only temporarily disorienting its physical form. As for the origins of SCP-1984, the Soviet Union's official liaison with the SCP Foundation offered some clarity on this. Ironically, during early 1984, the liaison, a doctor named Sergei, described information regarding the dead hand as being of grave importance to the continued survival of the human race. Seeing as he was referring to an enemy that could single-handedly launch the Soviet Union's entire nuclear arsenal, he certainly had a point. A top-secret conference was held in Sarajevo between the Foundation's O5 Council and officials from both the USSR and the United States, using the 1984 Winter Olympics as cover, avoiding too many questions about several nations' high-ranking state officials being in the same place at once. The O5 Council was then given full, in-depth information about the dead hand, something they had previously assumed was a more conventional form of nuclear deterrence. SCP-1984 was far more, and worse, far out of the control of the Russian government. It was revealed that the entity had been designated outside the original specifications given to those who developed it. Initially, the Soviets had intended for the dead hand to be solely used as a secure second strike response. If the leaders of the Soviet Union were killed, SCP-1984 would react in kind to Russia's enemies, launching back all of the USSR's nuclear missiles in retaliation. This is more likely where the dead hand nickname comes from, hearkening to the idea of a dead man's switch. Picture that you had been mortally wounded by your worst enemy, shot in the stomach and laying on the ground, rapidly bleeding out. You know that there is no chance you will survive, but you cannot afford to let your enemy get away. What they don't know is that you rigged the entire building around you both with explosives. With your dying breath, you activate the detonator, assuring your own and your enemy's mutual destruction. Kaboom. Then curtains for both of you. The pressing issue, and the reason this secret summit between the USSR, USA, and SCP Foundation was held, was that SCP-1984 was no longer interested in just waiting for Russia to be attacked and only reacting after the fact. Instead, the entity's physical form was trying to preemptively strike at the enemies of the motherland, attempting to activate nuclear launches and send atomic weapons to destroy the United States, France, West Germany, and the People's Republic of China. In other words, the dead hand was eager to get a head start at causing total nuclear annihilation, not to mention potentially killing millions and reducing target countries to little more than irradiated craters, awash with deadly nuclear fallout. Both the Soviet Union and the United States begged the SCP Foundation to intervene and contain SCP-1984, and under the direction of the O5 Council, they stepped in to take direct control of the situation, establishing new containment procedures in the hopes of keeping SCP-1984 from hitting as many launch buttons as it could find. The embalmed remains that seemed to create the manifestations of the dead hand entity were held securely in an armed containment complex near Verkhoyansk, part of the Sakha Republic within the Russian Federation. SCP-1984 was placed within a standard humanoid containment cell, which was itself held within a Faraday cage, a type of enclosure constructed with or covered in conductive material, designed to block electromagnetic fields. This was done to block any external broadcast signals from reaching SCP-1984, and thus causing it to manifest its other form if it learned of an impending attack on Russia, even a fictional one, perhaps as a part of a television broadcast. As part of the Dead Hand's containment, all signals broadcast near its cage are to be monitored, and only broadcasts featuring doctored information would reach the entity. Thankfully to the work of the SCP Foundation's Information Control Team, SCP-1984 is drip-fed a stream of carefully fabricated information. Using on-site equipment and facilities, a team of military historians, economists, actors, and Soviet media specialists, the Information Control Team have created an ongoing narrative wherein the Cold War never ended. Through falsified radio and television broadcasts made to look like era-appropriated news organizations, they managed to keep SCP-1984 convinced that the nuclear stalemate between the Soviet Union and United States is still ongoing. Unfortunately, sometimes information from the real world is able to bleed through. An incident involving SCP-1984 occurred on August 8, 1984, and almost brought forth a full-scale nuclear war. While preparing for a campaign speech, the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, uttered the following joke.
I am pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes.
Naturally, thousands of media outlets reported on this, but signals of those broadcasts, including recordings of the president's remark, made their way to SCP-1984. Foundation researchers were both unsure of how these transmissions breached the Faraday cage surrounding the dead hand, and were unable to prevent what happened next. Hearing what it could only assume was a genuine declaration of war, the manifestation of the SCP-1984-01 entity happened immediately after Reagan's words reached its containment cell. This time, the entity appeared as a semi-transparent woman, withered and blue, wearing traditional Pashtun dress. Armed personnel guarding SCP-1984's cage engaged the entity, causing it to retaliate, lashing out and attacking any that stood in its way. One captain and 2 privates that suffered the brunt of SCP-1984's offensive capabilities began bleeding heavily from their ears, seizing violently. Most gruesomely of all, a liquid leaked from their eyes and nose believed to have been cerebrospinal fluid. While armed personnel attempted to use microwave-emitting weaponry to slow the entity down, the Information Control Team was frantically trying to record a new falsified broadcast, in the hopes that SCP-1984 would cease its hostilities and the entity would dissipate before it was able to travel at high speed to any nearby Soviet nuclear facilities and begin bombarding the United States. Their first attempt to record a new broadcast that would result in a cessation of SCP-1984's slaughter of its guards was interrupted when a nearby wall collapsed. Desperate to recontain the creature, the Information Control Team tried to film the broadcast a second time and succeeded, although one of the actors portraying a newsreader suffered a stroke and had to be edited out to convince the dead hand of its supposed authenticity. What followed was a short news clip clarifying that Russia's Politburo was in on President Reagan's joke, including old footage of the USSR's General Secretary Konstantin Chernenko, confirming that the Soviet Union's nuclear forces were not on high alert. Miraculously, after 15 more minutes of sustained fighting with guards, SCP-1984's physical manifestation began to disappear, gradually dematerializing while it seemed to attack with far less intensity. Eventually, containment was reestablished, at the cost of the deaths of 17 members of Foundation staff, both guards and researchers. A further 8, however, suffered traumatic brain injuries that left them all permanently disabled. The one upside is that this incident remains the only time SCP-1984 has ever breached its containment and caused harm to others. And considering that it could very well have launched Russia's nuclear arsenal, the casualties could easily have been much higher. So remember, folks, don't joke about nuclear weapons, especially if you're the president. You never know what anomalies lurking in the bodies of dead Russian soldiers might be listening, and if they are,
you'd better hope they have a sense of humor. One of the primary aims of the SCP Foundation is to contain the anomalies that they discover. Secure, contain, protect is their mission statement after all. However, there are some forces so unknowable and malevolent that there is no way to truly contain them. SCP-4205 is one such force. Very little is known about SCP-4205, even compared to other SCPs, many of which are mysterious by their very nature. We do not know what it is, we do not know what it wants, and we do not have any meaningful way to stop it. The best that can be done to protect yourself from it is to implement the few known preventative measures available and pray that it doesn't set its sights on you. The little information that exists on SCP-4205 was recorded by Wade Dalitz, a former junior researcher at the Foundation. He wrote the initial report on SCP-4205 on a computer, Terminal 4. Though his work was highly valuable and provided many previously unknown insights about the nature of the SCP, sadly his knowledge could not save him. The official entry on SCP-4205 was his final act before his death on December 11th, 1992. Before we get deeper into that entry and Wade's final day on Earth, it's important to understand what SCP-4205 is, or at least understand the little we know about what it is. 4205 is a Keter-class SCP, meaning that it's incredibly difficult or complicated to contain. It also shows extreme hostility toward all life. It is described as an amber-colored pair of human-like eyes, with the ability to appear spontaneously in windows, mirrors, or any other glass or glass-like surface. One of the reasons so little is known about these eyes is that anyone who sees them dies within seconds. Much like the mythical basilisk, the gaze of SCP-4205 is deadly and inescapable. The eyes only seem to appear to people who are alone in a room, and never in places where there's more than one person. But aside from that, there is no way to predict where the eyes will appear. Since it is unknown if the eyes are part of a corporeal body or even present on this plane of reality, there is no way to contain them or stop them from killing. This brings us to that fateful day, December 11th, 1992. The day that the SCP Foundation would finally be given some tangible information on the mysterious amber eyes, at the cost of one of their researchers' lives. Wade Dalitz, a young man fresh out of his university studies, was brought on board as a junior researcher by Dr. Mark Forsyth, a senior researcher. Dr. Forsyth recruited Wade after giving a guest lecture at his university, and being impressed by Wade's keen observational skills, thirst for knowledge of the unexplained, and determination to understand that which seemed to defy explanation. After Wade graduated, he was recruited by Dr. Forsyth and given the position of junior researcher at the SCP Foundation, where he assisted Dr. Forsyth, now a site supervisor, in his research. After several months of working under Dr. Forsyth with minimal responsibilities, Wade was finally given the opportunity to write his first SCP report on SCP-4205. Following some initial documented appearances of 4205, Dr. Forsyth approved further research into the anomaly, with Wade appointed as the lead researcher on the subject. According to Wade's entry, he was responsible for the discovery of SCP-4205 when he spotted the anomaly in a window. Though later reviews of security footage determined that he was not the first person to observe the eyes, he did claim to be the first to observe them and live to tell the tale. In his writing on the subject, Wade is puzzled by the fact that he survived his encounter with SCP-4205 and wonders what could have set him apart from the others that fell victim to its gaze. He found himself frustrated as he documented SCP-4205, his rough drafts of reports dissolving into angry rants about his own incompetence. Wayne had difficulty adjusting to his new responsibilities, especially with the added element of his assigned subject's mysterious and volatile nature. In between his reports on SCP-4205, its previous appearances, and its effects on its victims, he wrote letters to his father, desperate for reassurance that he was not messing everything up, letters that would sadly go unsent. In his coverage of SCP-4205, Wade made note of a troubling reoccurring element in each victim's death. When medical professionals attempted to revive the victims, it was always noted that their brain activities stopped much more quickly than in cases of death by natural causes. When examined, All aspects of the body aside from the brain were completely unharmed. The brain, however, showed massive nerve damage in the amygdala, hippocampus, medial temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. The appearance of this brain trauma had been compared to the effects of electrical shock or a severe head injury. In addition to Wade, 6 other people on record encountered SCP-4205. Every encounter ended the same way, with sudden brain death and severe nerve damage immediately after viewing the eyes in a reflective surface. The first encounter occurred on January 5, 1990, when Deputy Liaison Genna viewed the eyes in a reflective glass one-way window. Security tape reveals that the eyes appeared in the window 8 minutes before the Deputy Liaison spotted them. As soon as he did, he fell from his chair and immediately died. Though the specifics varied from case to case, the end result of every encounter was the same, with none surviving long enough to relate what they had experienced, every encounter except Wade's. As he continued his documentation of SCP-4205, Wade's mental state quickly began to deteriorate, the process of his mind coming apart and his thoughts giving way to confusion, fear, and anger at his own survival is documented in his reports on the SCP. He agonized over the questions of why he was able to survive gazing into the eyes of SCP-4205 when so many others had not. The question consumed him until he was unable to eat, sleep, or do anything but obsess over the SCP he was tasked with researching. As he became more agitated, he began to write about the eyes appearing to him again. On one occurrence, he attempted to touch them and described the sensation like touching a balloon to your arm after it had been charged with static electricity. He continued to report seeing the eyes. The worst was when trying to sleep, during which he was overtaken by violent sleep paralysis and plagued with visions of the amber eyes. The only comfort Wade seemed to find was in memories of his loved ones. He wrote about his mother and his father, even as their memories grew foggier to him. He also mentioned a man by the name of Theodore Quayle, who he claimed was a researcher at the Foundation. Later fact-checking determined that this was not the case, and that Quayle must have been someone from Wade's past. He wrote about Quayle wistfully, mournfully, with words of love and loss, tormented by the sense that he was losing his grip on reality and everything he once held dear. As Wade descended deeper into a hell inside his own mind, he continued to mull over the questions of SCP-4205. Was there more to it than what was visible? Did it have a body? Why had he survived the encounter with it? And what did it want from him? He decided that those who had perished immediately were the lucky ones. They had escaped the torture that had overtaken his life. The eyes were everywhere now, watching him even as he attempted to unlock their secrets on a Foundation computer. He spoke to the eyes at one point, but refused to write down what they said to him. His last entry, his last thought, was a plea for Theodore Quayle's embrace. There is no more written about the research or about the eyes, only a simple, desperate need for a comfort that is long lost. Now is the part of our story where terror meets tragedy. Contrary to what Wade thought and what was recorded in his final computer entries, he did not survive his brief brush with SCP-4205. The truth is that he spotted the amber eyes in the glass above his terminal monitor while recording the entry and died seconds later. Though his death was swift, it felt agonizingly slow, as revealed by his descent into panic and paranoia recorded in his writings. The entries recorded as a result of the connection Wade and the computer, his physical contact with it at the moment of exposure to SCP-4205's anomalous effects, allowing the terminal to archive his final thoughts before he succumbed to the deadly nature of the eyes. The entries were never physically typed, but rather jumped from his dying mind into the mainframe. His entries, the echoes of a dying mind, offer a glimpse into the way that SCP-4205 kills its victims. In the seconds leading up to death, the amber eyes fast-forward a person's mind, feeding on the electrical impulses that it gives off as it speeds through what seems to be days of fear and of a loosening grip on reality. The death may be swift, but the suffering is long. Wade left the Foundation with a digital fingerprint, an echo of the person he was at his core, in addition to his experiences with SCP-4205 itself. Wade spent his final moments terrified for his life, dreaming of a father that he missed and a long-lost love from his college days. His sacrifice must not be forgotten, because no one ever survives an encounter with SCP-4205. His documented final moments are the only first-hand account in existence. Junior researcher Wade Dalitz gave us a gift in death. He allowed the SCP Foundation a glimpse into the true horror of the Amber Eyes and a reminder of what they are capable of stealing from us. So be careful of windows, mirrors, screens, and all reflective surfaces. When you look into them, you never know what you might see looking back. Ask yourself a simple question. Is the world around you real? It seems like the answer should be pretty obvious. Of course the world as you know it is real. How else would you be able to interact with it? Perhaps a better question would be this. How much do you trust that the world you know is real? How much do you believe that reality, as you experience it, is constant and cannot be changed by external forces? Now imagine, if you can, an entity to which the very fabric of reality is like clay, able to be shaped and molded at will. Then imagine that this entity, this malicious, twisted, and unknowable horror, has taken a special interest in you. If you can picture such a scenario, then you may as well be standing in the shoes of James Talleyrand, a Foundation researcher assigned to SCP-3999. Talleyrand could only have imagined what the Foundation kept contained in an airtight cell all the way at the bottom of a kilometer-long shaft, and never expected that this was where his lifeless body would be found. Despite having the entity contained, the Foundation's only knowledge of SCP-3999 came from a text document discovered on Talleyrand's phone after his demise. Even their own records indicated that no such creature ever existed. Why? What could possibly shape reality in such a way that it could hide its own existence from the Foundation? And where was it now? The document on Talleyrand's phone yielded some evidence, seeming to be a long, rambling, and confused account of some sort of battle between a reality-shaping entity and the ill-fated researcher sent to examine it. Unlike many of the Foundation's documents, the entry for SCP-3999 is riddled with contradictions and strike-throughs, a confusing mess of information that makes piecing together the mysteries of Talleyrand's fate all the more difficult. Beneath the strange formatting and uncertainty surrounding SCP-3999 lies the tale of one man's torture for the amusement of an impossibly powerful and eternally sadistic creature. Based on the information available, it appears that SCP-3999 was fixated on Talleyrand. Upon his arrival to the entity's cell, the researcher had no idea how long he would spend in the company of SCP-3999, or that he would never emerge alive. Many SCPs contained by the Foundation require their own specially made prisons in order to hold them and maintain the safety of Foundation staff as well as the outside world. But imagine if an SCP could turn the tables, bending the world around a single member of the Foundation, using all of reality as their own personalized torture chamber. The list of horrors endured by Talleyrand is both exhaustive and incomplete, given the length of time he spent with the creature. Shortly after James Talleyrand was assigned to Site-118, where SCP-3999 was contained, the entity was somehow able to breach containment and began to twist the world around it in the name of a singular, cruel objective: the torture of James Talleyrand. The creature, while having no physical description, possessed the capability to cause either a CK-class reality restructuring event or a ZK-class end-of-reality event. SCP-3999 was somehow able to both destroy reality itself while simultaneously rebuilding it around its prisoner, researcher Talleyrand. Every creature, person, and machination that SCP-3999 created was done so with the express intention of making Talleyrand suffer horribly over the course of millions of years, according to the researcher's own writings. The exact details of how SCP-3999 tortured Talleyrand are littered throughout the document he was found with, but it is apparent that the entity was able to use its reality-altering abilities to continually revive the man after killing him as a way to prolong his pain. SCP-3999 seemed to be able to use its powers however it pleased, but focused all its attention and actions on causing misery for one man. It simply enjoyed inflicting suffering. One of the examples of the atrocities James Talleyrand suffered at the mercy of a cold, remorseless creature was witnessing the deaths of others. Although they were constructed and controlled by SCP-3999,
Talleyrand saw trained Foundation security personnel drag 3 people into the cell. He recognized them instantly as his own family. Talleyrand was made to watch as his mother, father, and sister were executed with a single gunshot to the head by members of the same organization that he was a part of. All of Talleyrand's professional colleagues were also killed in front of him, followed by anyone and everyone that had come into contact with James Talleyrand, including the O5 Council. He was made to watch as they were systematically murdered one by one, all for the enjoyment of SCP-3999. At some point during the creature's torture of Talleyrand, there appears to have been some attempt to contain SCP-3999 within another SCP, SCP-2432, a room within a hotel now owned by the Foundation that appears to compel its guests to write exaggerated positive reviews after staying there. When introduced to SCP-2432, SCP-3999's ability to alter reality seemed to have the effect of creating a dimensional anomaly within the hotel. A crawlspace opened up in SCP-2432, leading to an almost identical room. The front door of this new room, designated SCP-2432-1, led to an alternate dimension that resembled the hotel housing SCP-2432. The rooms of this new version of the SCP-2432 hotel were a seemingly infinite, endless loop of rooms. This dimension also played host to a number of strange creatures, as uncovered by Foundation research teams that ventured there. Most notably, a creature resembling a male Homo sapien, calling itself Researcher Talleyrand. This being was dressed in clothing similar to Foundation researchers and appeared nervous and confused when approached by personnel, only to be executed when asked to be told the location of SCP-3999. Later during SCP-3999's 3 million year torture session, James Talleyrand was interviewed with another doctor working for the Foundation. The interviewing doctor had no recollection of Talleyrand's assignment to SCP-3999, and both James's involvement with the Foundation and the very existence of SCP-3999 were expunged from the Foundation's database. As Talleyrand desperately tried to rationalize what was happening to him, he told the interviewer, "I have trouble focusing on things now. I just feel a lot of unease. It's like reality has started to feel less real, if that makes sense." Shortly after, he attempted to ask the doctor for his name and for him to identify which of the Foundation sites they were at. In response, the doctor emitted a strange noise from his mouth, confusing Talleyrand. "That's not a name. You just made a noise with your mouth," the researcher replied. "Why am I thinking of redactions? How can a word be redacted like that in a normal conversation?" Following this, the floor beneath James Talleyrand's feet disappeared, and he was swallowed by darkness, as SCP-3999 continued bending reality to make him suffer. What followed were multiple failed attempts from Talleyrand to either escape from the entity or nullify its abilities to warp reality. SCP-3999 had, at a later point, trapped Talleyrand in a stage play version of its cell. As James frantically tried to escape out of a nearby door, where he hoped to find reality, he was met with a solid wall. "I'm trapped in whatever this place is with this thing, and there's no outside reality anymore," he realized. Researcher Talleyrand tried to understand the entity, but SCP-3999 defied description. It was simply chaos. In his desperation, Talleyrand was able to dig a tiny hole in the floor through which he could see a light, filled with thoughts of his beloved family, his colleagues, and the rest of the world that had once existed. He opened the hole wider. It is unclear what happened after this, but it is apparent that James Talleyrand was still unable to escape SCP-3999. However, as the situations he found himself in grew increasingly strange, James Talleyrand was able to take greater control of his predicament. This is evidenced in the Foundation's document regarding SCP-3999. Researcher Talleyrand cannot be contained by this. Researcher Talleyrand will fight his way back. Researcher Talleyrand will recontain SCP-3999. This torture had gone on long enough, and researcher James Talleyrand was determined to be free of the creature that had taken such sick pleasure in his pain. Talleyrand at one point was able to subdue SCP-3999, although it is initially unclear how he accomplished this. There were several attempts made to contain the entity, using a recursive joke, a melon, the graves of American crime novelist Robert B. Parker, or an O5 council member, and a roach motel. It is believed that every single one of these attempts failed. Attempting to beat the creature at its own game, Talleyrand tried to turn SCP-3999's reality-altering powers against it by imagining the entity as something easier to subdue. These included several moldy blankets, a murderous penguin, and a pillow. Eventually, Talleyrand was able to contain SCP-3999 with the aid of 48 trained containment personnel, all of whom were also researcher Talleyrand. During this time, a conversation between the two were partially recorded, although any dialogue from SCP-3999 suffered from data corruption. Claiming to finally be in charge and in control of the situation, Talleyrand interrogated SCP-3999, berating the creature for keeping him prisoner. "You can't frighten me anymore. For the first million years of nonsensical containment procedures and tortures and dream logic, it was the worst pain I had ever felt, but I survived. For the second million years, it was still the hardest thing I had ever done, but I survived. By the third million years, I was growing numb." The researcher tried to ascertain the exact nature and origin of SCP-3999, but to no avail. Vowing to fight the entity, Talleyrand told it, "Here's the thing about horror and weirdness. The more you reveal of it, the less effect it has. I am sick of your horror. I am sick of you." Afterwards, he was melted into goo for 5 years. It appears that shortly after this, researcher Talleyrand managed to understand how to destroy SCP-3999. While the entity was immortal and virtually unstoppable, he realized its weakness, that it had to bond to another being in order to survive. Upon discovering this, Talleyrand took his own life, causing all that SCP-3999 had done to disappear. After Foundation researcher James Talleyrand committed suicide, reality reverted to its original state, before SCP-3999 had heavily altered it. His death freeing reality from the evil entity once and for all. The Foundation remains unaware of what SCP-3999 was or indeed is, and one can only guess as to why the entity subjugated Talleyrand to such terror and horror. What made this powerful reality bender hold such a perverse fixation on one man? Some have likened the creature to a horror writer, continually subjugating a character to all manner of nightmares before deciding to redraft and try something new. Whatever it was, SCP-3999 carries with it a warning that reality isn't always as it seems.
Corpses littered the facility, around 20 in total. Their massacre had unfolded in a matter of seconds despite their advanced armor and heavy weaponry. Their killer, wielding an ancient sword he'd somehow pulled from thin air, looked upon them with disdain. Weak, unworthy opponents. He breathed heavily. His torso was covered with bullet wounds and many had punctured his lungs. It was enough to kill a normal man 10 times over, but not him. He was the ultimate warrior, the perfect killing machine. He would need to seek out an enemy more fitting for his legendary combat skills. He fled from the chamber into a connecting hallway, where a giant metal door slammed shut behind him. At the other end of a hall, another door did the same. He laughed at the thought of someone thinking he could be trapped so easily and charged towards it. But then, large valves began to open all around him. Torrents of freezing seawater began pouring in, filling up the chamber and submerging him before he could reach the door. The warrior fought for breath, and he held it far longer than any mortal man could, especially considering the state of his lungs. But water always wins. He soon gave his last gasp and floated, lifeless in the hallway. And soon after, his body turned to dust and disappeared in the briny water. But he would be back. He'd always be back. His brother was a different story. Tall and handsome, with a strange Sumerian rune tattooed on his forehead. He was practically a pacifist and spent most of his days reading, conversing with the staff, and wandering the facility of his own accord. Upon hearing of the latest incident at the facility, he gave a sigh. He knew on some level that all of this was his fault. It'd been centuries, millennia even, but was it too late to make things right? 6 days later, the two are standing face to face. This meeting had been a long time coming, but it was always destined to end in blood and pain. The man with the runic tattoo was unarmed. The only thing he carried was his regrets. The warrior, eyes full of burning fury, drew his sword, and not long after, a head, hit the floor. Who are these two strange men? And what is the significance of this fatal meeting? In our own universe, these two may never meet again, but that doesn't mean there isn't a universe out there where they will. And it is that universe where today's tale springs from. The story between these two began a long time ago, when they were both set on a course of destruction. But to learn how these two finally met once again, we only need to go back a few days. While they seem more human than a lot of beings under the SCP Foundation's watchful eyes, there's no doubt that these two are anomalous. They're known as SCP-073 and SCP-076, but better known as Cain and Abel. From the name alone, most people with a basic knowledge of the Bible could tell that these two have a connection, but the particulars were largely a mystery to the Foundation. They wanted to know how much of the story was actually true. SCP researchers approached SCP-073, aka Cain, and asked if he'd be interested in reuniting with his brother one last time. It took Cain 3 days to answer yes, but on one condition: that he was the only person who could abort the mission. The Foundation mulled over this requirement for 3 days before the O5 Council finally made a decision. Cross-testing approved. These two brothers, separated by millennia, would finally meet again, and the SCP Foundation would get to watch what happened when they did. Of course, for safety reasons, the cross-test would take place in 076's containment facility, a bedrock chamber 200 meters beneath the sea. That would be the closest thing to safe this fateful meeting could ever be. Though safe was really a relative term when it came to SCP-076. His escape attempts were as frequent and unpredictable as they were deadly, and everyone who'd ever worked with him knew exactly why. To the untrained eye, it would seem strange to create such a complex facility for a 3-meter squared stone cube, known as SCP-076-01. But the cube isn't what's being locked up here. The real danger comes from the corpse stored inside, known as SCP-076-02, but better known as Abel. He's a lean, olive-skinned man who appears to be in his late 20s, but his most distinct physical feature is the fact he's covered in an elaborate network of arcane and occult tattoos, largely of scowling, demonic faces, similar to those found on members of the Yakuza. Whenever Abel's corpse reanimates, as it does at random intervals, everyone in his vicinity is in terrible danger. He's capable of pulling bladed weapons out of miniature dimensional rifts that appear around him, though he does this so quickly that it seems as though the weapons are simply materializing in his hands. Despite the increasingly complex efforts to contain him, Abel has been able to breach containment and go on brutal rampages multiple times, killing scores of Foundation personnel in the process. Abel possesses superhuman strength, speed, and durability. During prior containment breaches, he was able to shrug off rounds from 50 caliber machine guns. He's torn through reinforced steel doors. He's even swatted bullets from both handguns and assault rifles out of the air with a length of steel rebar. Only killing him can truly end one of these rampages, and the Foundation has had to go to terrifying lengths in order to achieve this during past containment breaches. He's been drowned, asphyxiated, crushed, burned to death with a thermite grenade directly inserted into his chest cavity, and even disintegrated by the activation of the facility's on-site nuclear warhead. This may seem like overkill, but if Abel were ever to make his way into a major population center, the fatalities would be, well, of biblical proportions. Even death can't keep him down for long. His body will rapidly decompose and reappear intact within SCP-076-01. There's no telling when he'll reawaken, and his periods of inactivity can range from hours to years. Because of this, he must be constantly observed by guards highly proficient in close combat, and always ready to go toe-to-toe with perhaps the most dangerous melee combatant in history. He's such a proficient killer that there was once a project aimed at weaponizing Abel, but this turned out to be a disastrous failure for the Foundation. When they ran out of missions to give him, Abel's thirst for blood caused him to turn his blade on his allies with no remorse, hacking them up with the same ruthless abandon he gave his assigned enemies. Interestingly, Abel does seem to have a twisted sense of honor. He has respect for combatants capable of providing him with a real challenge, and has even expressed concern for guards he considers to be respectable adversaries. But don't be fooled. There is no reasoning with Abel. Either you kill him or he kills you. And trust us, he's much better at it than you are. While he's often overshadowed by world-ending anomalies or more talkative mass killers like SCP-682, Abel is one of the most deadly creatures known to the Foundation. Abel's counterpart, 073, is an entirely different story. Despite his namesake being the first biblical murderer, this Cain is a far more enigmatic figure. A tall man in his early 30s appearing to be of Middle Eastern descent, he has two very notable physical characteristics: the untranslated Sumerian symbol tattooed on his forehead, and the fact that several of his body parts, namely his arms, legs, spinal cord, and shoulder blades, have been replaced by mysterious prosthetics of unknown origin. Unlike Abel, Cain is polite, non-confrontational, articulate, and communicative. He's even allowed to wander the facility he's housed in freely, though with certain regulations. Namely that Cain is never permitted to come into contact with plant life or uncovered ground. This is because, in spite of the fact Cain doesn't appear to harbor any malicious intent, direct contact with him causes plants to wither and die, and the ground to become infertile. If Cain was ever introduced into a natural environment again, he could unwittingly cause an ecological catastrophe with his mere presence. In that sense, he could almost be as dangerous to large populations as Abel. However, Cain's danger to flora is only one of his several anomalous qualities. Another is extraordinary mental capabilities and a near-perfect memory. His memory and ability to recall is so good that some Foundation personnel have suggested using Cain's mind as a kind of backup server for the Foundation's collective knowledge. But perhaps his most well-known anomalous trait is his ability to act as a kind of immortal human voodoo doll. That's right. Any damage inflicted on Cain causes no permanent injury to him and is reflected back on the perpetrator. While Cain has remarked on still being able to feel the pain of these assaults, he's functionally immortal. This damage-reflecting ability has even made performing certain kinds of tests impossible, as doctors attempting to draw blood from Cain have found that their sample was actually their own blood, and their skin exhibited the telltale bruising and puncture marks of blood testing. But of most interest to the Foundation right now was the fact that Cain has shown prior knowledge of Abel. However, he was cagey when questioned. He refused to add any additional information and commented that it would be best if he and Abel were never brought into contact. But what does never really mean when you live forever? Cain finally did agree to the test. And while nobody knew what caused Cain's change of heart, the Foundation knew better than to push him and potentially get the entire mission scrapped. Cain was taken from his facility and transported to the access point of Abel's underwater prison. The experiment's design was simple. Cain would occupy a temporary residence in Abel's containment facility until he next reanimated, at which point the interaction between them would be closely observed. Perhaps it would take weeks, months, or even years before Abel once again awoke and left his cube. But when he did, Cain would be there. Thankfully, as Cain whispered soothing words into Abel's tomb, the resurrection took only minutes. If you were expecting a heartwarming reunion, think again. Cain tried to apologize, but Abel immediately struck him with a decapitating blow, which, due to Cain's damage-reflecting properties, caused him to sever his own head instead. Cain remained at Abel's side as he regenerated, and as soon as Abel did, he immediately tried killing Cain again. It went on like this again and again and again. It was an arduous process, and eventually, even Abel began to tire of it. The duo fell into a tearful embrace. Abel asked his brother why he killed him so long ago, and Cain apologized, saying it was the actions of a younger and more foolish man. In that moment, the two finally reconciled, and having fulfilled their bargain with their creator, both finally crumbled into dust. Peace at last. As we said, this didn't happen to the Cain and Abel of our universe, but when universes are more numerous than grains of sand in an endless desert, such a thing has indeed happened somewhere out there, perhaps in a kinder universe than our own. We can only hope that Cain and Abel may someday get to meet and find the same resolution. But until then, these brothers will remain one of the most dangerous and fascinating duos in the Foundation's catalog. The esteemed Dr. Thomas Morstead entered the cell of the anomaly. He'd been warned and even chastised by his colleagues. But who in the Foundation could tell him what to do? He was the best at what he did, maybe the greatest in the whole history of the Foundation. As he entered the room, SCP-049 bid him welcome, cordial as always. So polite, in fact, that you'd never guess you were talking to a killer. Dr. Morstead knew the truth of what he was dealing with, but he also believed he could get through to 049. Calm him, exorcise the devil from him. It was the meeting of two great minds, one of them human, one of them part human, part something that has never been clear. It was to be a battle of wits, and like so many great battles, this one would turn into a massacre. Before we get to that fateful meeting, there are some things you should know about the anomaly known as SCP-049. If you saw him in the street, the first thing you'd think of is plague, because 049 always looked the same. A man dressed in black robes with a plague doctor's mask. But this wasn't a costume that could be taken off. In fact, it wasn't a costume at all. It was him. The robes had grown out of him like an exoskeleton. That horrible mask with the pointed nose wasn't covering his face. It was his face. A kind of shell that had seemingly sprouted from bone. The first reports came during World War II. In a picturesque town in the south of France called Montauban, people had begun going missing. Children disappeared from their beds in the middle of the night and weren't seen again. Adults went to the market and never returned. Local authorities searched high and low. They scoured nearby woods and dragged the rivers, but nothing was found. Because what was happening wasn't criminal, there was no clue they could stumble upon or eyewitness who would break the case. No, this was something else. Something that the townsfolk could never understand. Word spread, and that's when a search and discovery team was sent from the Foundation. It was a cold, dark night in January of 1941 when the team found what they were looking for. They walked through the open door of a small house located not too far from the Grand Chateau de Richelieu to find a masked man sitting next to an open fire. And he wasn't alone. The floor around him looked like it was moving. Upon closer inspection, the team saw that the floor was covered with writhing, grasping bodies. It's patients, as it called them. Bienvenue chez moi, said the thing. Welcome to my home. Those so-called patients crawled towards the team, intent it seemed to cause harm. The hostiles, now known as SCP-049-2s, were deemed dangerous and had to be eliminated. A sight, it seemed, that didn't bother 049 in the slightest. It just sat there, occasionally looking up from writing notes in a leather-bound book as his patients were gunned down. Once the carnage ended, it simply closed its book, stood up, and allowed itself to be escorted away. And that's the story of how 049 ended up at the facility, becoming a guest of sorts, staying in a standard secure humanoid containment cell, Research Sector 02, Site 19. The few that came into contact with 049 remarked that it was a pleasure for them. With its impeccable manners, vast knowledge of medicine and human anatomy, sharp tongue, and stinging wit. They almost became spellbound listening to it, caught in the throes of its charms until, with the simple touch of its hand, it would drain the life from them. That's why SCP-049 was classified as a Euclid. That's why armed guards were always stationed outside its cell. It's why doctors took great precautions when in its presence, and it's why Dr. Morstead should have known better. Remember, when 049 was discovered in France, it willingly went with the team, like it was happy it had been found, as if it had planned its own capture. When it arrived at the facility, it didn't act like it was contained against its will. It was like it was returning home. Initial findings as to the biology of 049 were that it didn't require any sustenance at all, not even water. It seemed content to be left alone with its notebooks. It did not object when it was asked if it could share some of its notes and gladly handed over its journals. But upon examination, it was discovered that they were written in the language that no linguist or cryptologist has so far been able to translate. It's apparent that 049 derives much satisfaction from seeing so-called experts struggle over its text. Unable to read those notes, a long line of doctors visited 049 in its cell, each fascinated by what they beheld. It was learned that it has traveled the globe. It speaks many languages, but prefers to speak what it calls les langues de l'amour, French. It asked for only one thing: warm-blooded animals. The facility agreed to supply 049 with various kinds, including rabbits, cattle, and even an ape on one occasion. Just like with humans, it could kill the animals with a mere touch of its hand, sucking the life right out of them. But that wasn't even the most incredible part. Soon those animals would rise again, as if reanimated by 049. They would become, for all intents and purposes, the living dead. And they were hostile. After several unfortunate incidents, they were taken from the cell the moment they arose and disposed of in the incinerator. This was not to the liking of 049, who would claim it had cured the animals. For it, the world was sick. It saw plague and pestilence everywhere, and the meaning of its existence was to rid the world of disease. Humans, it said, contained a virus and had to be cleansed. In the first days after arriving at the facility, 049 didn't seem to pose a threat to humans. He was quite friendly, in fact. It seemed aware of the fear it caused in staff and would often go out of its way to make them feel comfortable and safe. This was a ruse, of course, or a canard, as 049 liked to say. It had no intention to help humans. No, it had come for humans. It wasn't trapped. It had set a trap. One of the first people to truly upset 049 was Dr. Raymond Ham, a well-respected physician that had twice been a contender for the Nobel Prize for his more mainstream work. What had confused Dr. Ham the most was not 049's clothes-like exoskeleton, or even his ability to reanimate the dead, but the bag that it used. 049 was somehow able to pull a seemingly endless supply of surgical tools from that bag. Sometimes it would even pull out objects that were somehow larger than the bag itself. It was as if the bag connected to somewhere else. And that's what Dr. Ham wanted to talk about on that fateful day. With 049 on one side of the cell and Dr. Ham on the other, he asked, "How is it that you can produce a great quantity of tools from that bag? I've observed you, and it seems to me that you are doing the impossible." "Dear doctor," replied 049, "the scourge, the great dying, cannot be fought with a handful of toys. My bag is merely the product of my imagination. It gives me what I require. You, dear sir, it seems, are limited by your imagination." It stopped for a second or two and stared at Dr. Ham. "I detect you are unwell," it said, in a voice not as amiable as before. "It's just a cold," said the doctor. "Ah, just a cold. If you had seen what I have seen, you would not utter such insulting words." Dr. Ham pulled out some papers from a briefcase and approached 049, holding them close enough so it could read them. "You see," said Dr. Ham, pointing to the results on the paper, "those animals you say you cured, they were not diseased. They were perfectly healthy before they died, and your so-called cure, it turned them into something quite terrible. We found that if they were left alone, they began to eat each other, and then themselves." 049 did not respond, and after a brief pause said only, "A good day to you, doctor. Please close the door on your way out. You should get some rest." Ham refused to go, and instead turned the conversation to this real interest, the bag, demanding that 049 let him see inside of it. "Very well, doctor," 049 said. "In private." 049 began to pull a series of long metal poles out of its bag, followed by a rolled-up curtain that it hung between them, creating a kind of medical tent around Dr. Ham. It seemed to stare for just a moment into the observation camera outside of itself before whipping the curtain shut. Dr. Ham was discovered 3 hours later, crawling around the floor of 049's cell, now another mindless undead. When he was retrieved by security, 049 didn't even look up from his notebook. Dr. Ham didn't get the incinerator treatment, but he did receive a fatal dose of drugs, a mercy. A removal team was sent to 049's cell, but it had said there was no need for special extraction techniques. It would go willingly, wherever they wanted to go. It was not, it said, an enemy of the people. "The Hippocratic Oath forbids me to hurt a human being," it said while walking to the interrogation center. "My only desire is to offer you my services and expertise." The floors and walls of the interrogation center room were painted a bright white. Even the table was white, which contrasted with 049, a mass of black sitting in the middle of the room. During the interrogation, it refused to admit or even accept that it had killed Dr. Ham. "I cured him. I removed the pestilence from his body," it said. It was later asked if it regretted its actions, to which it replied, "Well, good sir, one always regrets the loss of a colleague for any reason, but I stand by my actions. The pestilence must be abated before it is too late." Every 2 weeks from that point, 049 was given animals. The scientists at the facility observed it time and again, touching the animals, killing them, before producing a saw or a scalpel and opening them up. Organs would be carefully removed with perfect precision. It was astounding to even trained surgeons just how talented 049 was. "I require a close relative of yours," said 049 one day to a young doctor, who expressed shock that it was asked for one of the doctor's family members. "I mean a great ape," said 049, "not your dear aunt." There were several instances of 049 displaying a crude sense of humor. Staff would almost forget that the thing that they were talking to wasn't human.
almost. And it was Dr. Thomas Morstead that had supplied the great apes, orangutans in fact, that had been rescued from the rainforests of Borneo, only to be taken to 049's cell. Then one day something changed. 049 told Dr. Morstead that its work was done, that it accomplished what it had wanted to do, and could someone remove the cured animal from its cell? I think you'd find that it's quite the work of art. A triumph, 049 said through the intercom. When the removal team entered the cell, they found the orangutan, or what was left of it. It was lying in the corner of the cell. The top of its skull had been removed, leaving its brain exposed. On its face was the expression of relaxation, and from its mouth it issued very soft squeaks, like that of an infant. 049 said, "Tell Dr. Morstead that its rage mechanism no longer exists. I've removed the amygdala and made some changes to the hypothalamus and limbic system. It is cured and quite harmless." The next day, Dr. Morstead announced that he wanted to visit 049's cell himself, after which he heard a chorus of disapproval from his colleagues, all telling him that 049 was now too dangerous. "Dr. Ham was sick," replied Morstead, "and 049 has assured us that he would never take another human life. He's never lied to us, and I'm going to take him at his word." It appeared that 049 had created the perfect specimen, so what was next? Dr. Morstead had to know. "Everyone is sick," 049 told Dr. Morstead after the two had talked for a couple of minutes. "The great pandemic has started. Fear not, doctor. I have a cure. No longer will you humans spread your disease." "I'm afraid you are wrong," replied the doctor. "This pandemic you speak of does not exist. We can happily live with our pathogens. We have done so for millennia." Dr. Morstead became angry that he couldn't get through to 049. "I'm afraid you are suffering from paranoia. It is you who need to be cured." "You have no idea," said 049, standing up. "What are you doing?" shouted Morstead. "You promised you wouldn't hurt a human again." "I'm not hurting you. I'm healing you," 049 said and leapt across the room in a flash. Placing a hand on the doctor's head, Morstead slumped to the ground. They were being watched in the observation room, and this had gone too far. He had to be moved to the containment cells, permanently. Mobile Task Force Epsilon 11 was right on the scene and burst through the door. "No imagination," 049 said to himself. "Those humans have no imagination at all." He began walking towards the task force, who opened fire on the anomaly, but the bullets bounced off its black coat and mask. SCP-049 calmly touched each of the members of the task force, one by one, draining the life from them. The last one standing stopped firing and attempted to run, but again 049 leapt across the room, black cape billowing out behind him, and gently touched the man, causing him to drop to the floor. 049 stepped over the bodies of the fallen team and walked out of the containment cell. The full details of what happened next are available only to the O5 Council, what are sometimes called the Overseers. The redacted report that is available reads, "Standard Secure Humanoid Containment Cell, Research Sector 02, Site 19, Subject, SCP-049. Date of breach, redacted. Euclid Class SCP-049 breached cell and subsequently gained access to adjoining rooms and nearby buildings. Breach lasted approximately 3 days and 5 hours. Total casualties, redacted, with redacted number of survivors requiring incineration therapy. Course of action, Department of Science Alchemy Division suggested injecting anti-transmogrify disinfectant into Class D former prisoners who were transported to site and allowed them to come into contact with SCP-049. SCP failed to reanimate injected prisoners and cure them. SCP-049 acknowledged this failure and surrendered to Mobile Task Force Alpha-1. SCP-049 then requested to be contained. Present containment under responsibility of redacted, redacted. Present location of SCP-049, redacted. End of report. A veteran worker of the SCP Foundation sits at his terminal, performing one of the most critical tasks in the entire organization, creating a file for an as-yet undescribed SCP. But there's something terribly wrong. His eyes are glazed over. His mouth hangs open. Is this a zombie or a trained Foundation researcher? What is going on? Like any large international organization, it takes more than just the exciting, action-filled jobs to keep the wheels turning at the SCP Foundation. Sure, the head researchers, guards, Mobile Task Force soldiers, and members of the O5 Command get all the praise. But a legion of number crunchers, cleaners, and paper pushers are equally important. One such person was archivist Walter Bainbridge, who had been tasked with digitizing some of the older records that the Foundation had on file.
It was when he was innocently recording the details on SCP-050 through 060 that he first came under the strange and startling effects of SCP-055. But the most peculiar part, as with all incidents of SCP-055's anomalous effects taking hold, is that Walter had no idea any of it was happening. In his new digitized filing system, he first took note of SCP-053, Euclid class, also known as the young girl. This anomaly was a seemingly normal human female child who provoked homicidal insanity in those directly exposed to her. Then SCP-054, Safe class, a non-aggressive humanoid female made entirely of, as well as biologically and chemically identical to regular spring water. Next, SCP-056, Euclid class, a being that changes form to suit its environment, but only when all observers lose focus of it. And then SCP-057, Safe class, an underground chamber that crushes the humans who walk within. It was at this point that Walter received a concerned message from one of his superiors at Site-19, Mr. Kovac. The message praised the thorough digitization of the other anomalies' records, but was confused about why Walter had left out any mention of SCP-055. Immediately, Walter was embarrassed. How could he have forgotten SCP-055? That iconic anomaly known for... well, he couldn't quite say off the top of his head, but he'd be sure to look into it. A quick trip to the Site-19 archive showed him that there was actually quite a hefty file on the nature of SCP-055, which must have been the result of a huge number of studies. What struck him as strange was that all the files were filled out in pen rather than being typed up like a traditional file. The majority of these notes were written in shorthand too, as though they were frantically taken during the tests themselves on extremely short notice. There weren't even any redactions. Walter made a mental note of what he had seen, put the file back in its proper place, and headed back to his computer terminal. However, after writing in an almost trance-like state, he looked back on his work to see that he had written an entry on SCP-058, a giant evil bovine heart with insect legs and a scorpion stinger. Strange, he thought. That's when Walter got a call from Mr. Kovac on his Foundation issue phone, and he didn't sound happy. He'd given Walter direct instructions to go back and digitize the files on 055, and instead he'd been working on 058. What was the meaning of this? Walter was typically an extremely loyal and diligent employee, but the verbal barrage from his supervisor had him considering talking back, just this once, and hoping it didn't get him demoted to D class and thrown into 682's acid bath for playtime. Walter gulped, picked up some courage, and interrupted Mr. Kovac's rant to ask if he had any idea what SCP-055 actually was. The line went silent for a moment, then his supervisor spoke again, this time with less confidence.
Of course I can tell you about SCP-055. It's a classic, one of the first 100. How could you forget it's, I think it's the one with,
Another long pause as Mr. Kovac seemed to search for the words, but instead just trailed off into silence. Knowing that some of the anomalies on file were dangerous mimetic hazards, Walter was worried for a moment that he may have accidentally killed his boss by getting him to think too hard about SCP-055. He asked if Mr. Kovac was okay, and finally got a reply.
I'm sorry, I seem to have zoned out for a second there. What were we talking about again?
But this time it was Walter who couldn't answer. He had no idea at all what the two of them were discussing just moments ago. He felt disoriented and kind of sick, like they'd taken some low-level amnestics. Mr. Kovac told Walter to get back to his filing duties and they'd speak later. Walter then checked the messages he'd received from Mr. Kovac earlier, and there it was, plain as day. You missed 055. Go back and digitize that before proceeding, Mr. K. But Walter had never even heard of an SCP-055 if such an anomaly even existed. What was going on here? In that moment, Walter realized he was dealing with something much stranger than just a standard digitization job. After all, how could he properly complete his duties if SCP-055 seemed to be impossible to speak, write, or even think about, unless he were directly observing it at that moment? Walter had to know and ask around the entirety of Site-19 to find the answers if he had to. Sadly for Walter, he was about to embark on a much more challenging task than he could have ever imagined. To paraphrase a supposed quote from Socrates, "All I know is that I know nothing." And that's also about the extent of the knowledge we have on SCP-055, also known as the anti-meme and the self-keeping secret. What does it look like? When and how was it obtained by the Foundation? What are its anomalous abilities? Is this thing dangerous? We may never know, because the only anomalous ability of SCP-055 that we're aware of is the fact that nobody is capable of retaining any information about it. It's crucial to note that whatever 055 is, it isn't invisible or indescribable. Foundation personnel are perfectly capable of entering its containment chamber and observing it without incident, but mere minutes after leaving the chamber, any memories of the particulars of 055 seem to spontaneously erase themselves. Hence, the self-keeping secret. But this didn't deter Walter. Perhaps his greatest advantage was that he didn't know enough about the thing he was investigating to know how futile his mission was. He wanted to know the unknowable, and a pesky issue like impossibility wouldn't stop him. He'd get to whoever he needed to at Site-19 to get the answers he needed. Of course, most people had no knowledge of the mysterious anomaly. The common response he got back from his colleagues was, "055? Do we even have a 055? While the realization of sudden memory loss, or the realization of 055's existence, has been known to cause momentary stress, there are no known long-term physical or mental effects from 055's anomalous abilities. It's a fleeting idea in its purest form, like forgetting why you walked into a room. 055 could be the most harmless object on the Foundation's roster, or the most deadly. Either way, we just don't know. At times, Walter worried he was going insane. 055 and everything related to it was gaslighting him. Was 055 even real? The one thing that proved to him that 055 must have existed is that its containment chamber existed. According to the official records kept by the Foundation on the Site-19 containment facilities, 055 is kept in a 5x5 by 2.5 meter square room, constructed of 50-foot thick cement, with a Faraday cage surrounding the cement walls. The report continues that access is via a heavy containment door measuring 2 by 2.5 meters, constructed on bearings to ensure door closes and locks automatically unless held open deliberately. 055 cell is one of the few to have no posted security guards, and any personnel working on other SCPs in the area are ordered to remain at least 50 feet from the geometric center of 055 cell, where the anomaly itself is kept. When he tried to explore further why the cell was constructed in this manner, he found that, surprise, surprise, nobody knew. 055 was an anomaly whose containment requirements were so mysterious that it automatically netted itself a Keter class designation. After all, how can you properly contain something you can't even hope to comprehend? There were plenty of rumors about the true nature of 055. Some of the more conspiratorial minds at Site-19 theorized that 055 was actually an autonomous or remotely controlled spy inserted into the site to observe Foundation operations, or even humanity as a whole. If you're on the more paranoid end of the psychological spectrum, this theory makes total sense. An anomaly that's physically impossible to remember, even when writings and pictures on the subject exist, would be a perfect spy. However, this was all ultimately little more than speculation. Walter was barely any further along than when he started. There were multiple points in his investigations where Walter seriously considered giving up, until finally, he had a major breakthrough. Dr. Bartholomew Hughes and Dr. John Marichek were two scientists that had performed extensive research into 055, and who, Walter hoped, might have the answers he sought about the self-keeping secret. These scientists were the first to discover the anti-mimetic nature of 055, performing numerous tests on D-Class personnel to see if it was possible to create feasible written records, sketches, or any other records or impressions that could bypass its anomalous effects. The disorienting, memory-ruining effects of 055 also extend to any materials concerning 055.
It seems to be a truly uncrackable code, but Dr. Hughes may have finally found some cracks in the armor. For starters, the fact that we're able to remember that 055 is an antimimetic is an ironic exception to its antimimetic qualities. This revelation also inspired another realization from Dr. Hughes. Would it be possible to discover more about 055 from the process of deduction rather than the typical induction? In other words, could they possibly learn about 055 by figuring out all the things it isn't rather than what it is? Dr. Marichek designed an experiment with Dr. Hughes to explore this theory. They designed the experiment around a simple question: is 055 not spherical? In designing the question to specifically find out what 055 isn't, they hoped to subvert the anomaly's antimimetic powers. Walter was fascinated by this potential method of getting answers. Marichek and Hughes found that, while the questioning process for those exposed was often arduous and frustrating, they could now definitely say that 055 is not a sphere. It is theoretically possible to discover the true nature of 055 by an almost endless barrage of deductive questions, though whether Command would authorize the resources for such extensive testing is still an open question. Walter in his desperation begged Marichek and Hughes for clearance to view 055 himself. The curiosity had become too great during his search to just walk away with the single fact that 055 wasn't spherical. He needed to see this thing. And after several weeks of filling out forms and cutting red tape, his wish was finally granted. Walter Bainbridge was allowed a private audience with SCP-055, the subject of his months-long obsession. Outsiders observed that Walter spent just over an hour in the containment chamber, taking photos, drawing sketches, writing down notes, recording audio logs, and reciting memory mnemonics. He was pulling out every stop to counteract the antimimetic effects of the self-keeping secret. He was adamant that he would not be defeated by his non-spherical nemesis, not after all this time and effort. Once his time in the 055 containment chamber was over, he retired back to his office to finally digitize his exhaustive findings, so that his supervisor, Mr. Kovac, would finally get off his back. Walter smiled, took a deep breath, and began to type. SCP-059, Keter Class. This anomaly is a radioactive mineral that emits a unique radiation known as delta radiation. Exposure to this radiation has caused strange fungal growths on the infected... Wait, what was this supposed to be about again? Oh well, it couldn't have been that important. A month ago, Dr. Robert Maxwell was a senior researcher working at the facility, but a tragic mistake had cost the lives of several of his co-researchers. Now he was being led down a bleak hallway in Armed Biocontainment Area 14, a rifle-wielding guard flanking him on either side. The once rising researcher had a very different title now, D-8724. He had been made a D-class personnel, a death sentence. However, as the guards led him to his possible demise, he wasn't dressed in the typical D-class orange jumpsuit. No, he was dressed in frilly Rococo dining wear more typical of 18th century France. If anything, Dr. Maxwell looked like he was on his way to meet royalty, and in a sense, he was. The former researcher had begged for any other assignment, but the site director insisted on committing Dr. Maxwell to tea time with SCP-082. He'd always been the talkative type, so the two would make a perfect pairing. And if the creature found him sufficiently amusing, then Maxwell might even leave the containment cell alive. He had heard legends of the giant creature they called the Cannibal. Maxwell hoped they were just stories. Dr. Maxwell was pushed by the guards into a large, luxuriously appointed room, and the doors were locked behind him. He felt like a child, surrounded by freakishly large furniture and 10-foot-high ceilings. The fog of obnoxious floral perfumes couldn't fully cover up the pervasive smell of death that lingered in the cavernous halls of 082's palace. Thanks to an elaborate ruse conducted by the Foundation, SCP-082 believed he was the King of France, and that his containment cell was a palace where he remained for his own safety. The creature's continued good behavior and everyone else's safety relied on visitors keeping up that lie. Maxwell had never worked in this area of the facility, so a lot of the standard procedures were new to him.
Still, his superior had given him a clear directive: talk to the monster, communicate with him, be cordial and friendly. See if you can find out more about his mysterious past. And most importantly, if you want to survive, don't annoy him. The down-on-his-luck scientist gulped inside, trying to steady his nerves in this oversized fake French palace. He just kept thinking, surely he can't be that big. He almost talked himself into believing that the accounts of the creature were just that, tall tales, until a huge figure began lumbering into the main chamber. It was him, SCP-082, also known as Fernand the Cannibal. SCP-082 was an 8-foot-tall hulking monster, built sturdier than the castles it likes to imagine are its true home. Swollen, bloated, and grossly out of proportion, the creature clocks in at over 700 pounds, most of which is pure muscle that's almost impossible to pierce with conventional weaponry. SCP-082 stopped just feet away and stared at Dr. Maxwell with its beady, sunken-in eyes like a hungry rat. Just the sight of it struck terror into Dr. Maxwell's heart, but he didn't dare show his fear. Instead, he remembered his brief training, bowing politely and forcing a smile, referring to the creature as Your Highness, and profusely thanking it for granting him an audience. The monster continued staring without saying anything, and then gave a wide, lockjawed grin, showing off its huge teeth. It did everything through gritted teeth, except eat and sing. Dr. Maxwell hoped he wouldn't be a part of either activity. Fernand gave a low, booming chuckle. He thanked Dr. Maxwell for coming to give him some company and invited him to come further inside and take a seat, adding, with a sly wink, that he won't bite. The monster complained that he so rarely gets visitors to the palace these days, but he omitted the fact that the main reason for this was his tendency to devour them. Maxwell nodded and followed the giant deeper into its oversized abode. He couldn't help but notice that the monster's arms looked like huge, fleshy punching bags. He knew that if Fernand wanted to, he could easily crush him flat, just like he'd done to so many unfortunate guards during containment breaches. Fernand told Dr. Maxwell that he was thinking of having some decorating work done. The walls of his palace were starting to look awfully drab, and he gestured to one covered with a rusty red streak. Maxwell remembered that D-class cleaners were sent into the containment cell twice a month to tidy any of Fernand's messes, but they often ended up becoming one of the messes themselves. The creature encouraged Maxwell to take a seat at his oversized dining table, while he tended to a pot of what he said was full of delicious onion soup. Maxwell obliged his host's request and took a seat at a huge chair that made him look like a 6-year-old sitting at the grown-ups table. Meanwhile, Fernand was using a huge machete-like knife to cleave onions in half for his bubbling pot of stew. Even though Fernand had shown no signs of outward aggression, as he watched the cannibal hack away at onions with his enormous knife, Maxwell could feel himself beginning to sweat. After all, they didn't call this creature the Cannibal for nothing. This was a monster with a truly horrifying body count. During previous containment breaches, it had taken enough tranquilizer to put down 2 elephants to subdue the creature, but not before multiple agents quite literally lost their heads in the process. Fernand was able to bite them off with one huge chomp like he was eating a drumstick, snapping right through the bone with his incredible tooth and jaw strength. Surprisingly, when he wasn't on a violent rampage, Foundation researchers had found SCP-082 to be unusually polite and forthcoming, offering the researchers plenty of information about himself and his past. The only problem was that almost everything the creature said was a complete lie. From his time as a researcher, Maxwell knew that there were only a few details about the creature that could be ascertained for certain. SCP-082 would reliably answer to the name Fernand, and genetically, Fernand was technically human. The means by which Fernand became so grotesquely huge, strong, and cannibalistic are still unknown. Foundation personnel are still looking into whether it's due to some kind of anomalous genetic mutation or by more supernatural means. All we know is that he's big, unpredictable, and extremely dangerous. Dr. Robert Maxwell sat terrified at the dining table of SCP-082, listening to Fernand's slightly dull blade chop through the final onion, which he then tossed into the boiling soup.
Fernand had switched the topic of conversation to one of his favorite fictional characters, Hannibal Lecter. Of course, Hannibal the Cannibal isn't quite so fictional to Fernand. While he's been shown to be extremely intelligent in terms of puzzle solving and memory, he seems to have no understanding of the distinctions between fiction and reality. He assumes all movies and TV shows are a form of documentary or reality television. And ever since seeing The Silence of the Lambs, Fernand has been eager to meet with Dr. Lecter, which he emphasized to Maxwell over and over. Since trying to explain the concept of fiction to Fernand had never previously worked, Maxwell simply told him that Dr. Lecter is extremely busy at the moment, but will visit whenever he gets a chance. This seemed to satisfy Fernand, who placed 2 large bowls of steaming soup on the table before sitting down a little too close to Maxwell. He couldn't help but notice that the giant cannibal was now sitting within biting distance, and as a lowly D-class, nobody would be rushing in to save him if things went south. Fernand began ranting through his clenched teeth once more, occasionally stopping to consume a hefty spoonful of onion soup. Maxwell was sure to do the same, not wanting to seem anything less than polite. But soon the tenor of Fernand's rant began to shift. Typically the monster spoke French or heavily accented English. Now he was affecting the accent of a Victorian gentleman, peppering his speech with tally-ho and the game is afoot. Maxwell was confused at first, but quickly realized the game Fernand was playing. It's well known that Fernand is a pathological liar who likes to play numerous characters, changing his mannerisms and clothes accordingly. These personas have included a vampire, Big Bird, Andre the Giant, Foundation researcher Dr. Bright, the Incredible Hulk, Alexander the Great, Captain Hook, Dr. Frankenstein, and Frankenstein's monster. And, of course, in this case, the iconic fictional detective, Sherlock Holmes. Fearing for his life in this strange situation, Dr. Maxwell did the only thing he could: play along. As Fernand reeled off his Holmesian delusions, Maxwell began to play the role of Dr. John Watson, asking follow-up questions and complimenting Fernand's impeccable deductive reasoning. And it seemed to be working. Fernand played along too, acting as though the two of them really were Arthur Conan Doyle's crime-fighting duo. Towards the end of their game, Dr. Maxwell was even starting to enjoy it, amazed that his quick thinking was actually keeping him safe. But just then, the cannibal froze, as if in a trance. He locked eyes with Dr. Maxwell, like a mad dog that you can't tell if it's going to bite you or not. He saw the creature's gargantuan teeth separating, its huge jaws stretching open. This could surely only mean one thing. Dr. Maxwell winced and prepared for death, cursing that all of his quick thinking had amounted to nothing. Fernand leaned towards him, his gaping maw with its hot onion-scented breath just inches away from Maxwell. And then, he began to sing. The cannibal broke into a raucous Victorian pub song, happy and jovial. In his moment of terror, Dr. Maxwell had forgotten that this was the other reason SCP-082 opens his nightmarish jaws. Relief washed over him, as he knew he was safe, at least for the moment. Not long after, Foundation guards arrived and escorted him from the cell, leaving the delusional giant to his own devices back in the so-called palace. The former researcher had done it. He had bested Fernand the Cannibal, and hopefully it would be the last time he'd ever be face to face with that deranged giant. Unfortunately for Dr. Robert Maxwell, in a performance review later that week, one of his superiors remarked that Fernand enjoyed his company and he had done a great job. Such a good job, in fact, that Fernand insisted he have Dr. Maxwell for dinner, or any other meal for that matter, sometime very soon. Now go check out SCP-096 The Shy Guy and SCP-3000 Anantashisha for more tales to capture the imagination from the SCP Foundation.